Well, let's just jump in. Our first stop in Revelation. Again, we're not doing verse by verse commentary. We're not doing end time stuff. We're going to go through the book, and we're going to look at places. Maybe not like every place, but a lot of places. Most of the places, I think, would be fair to say, where the book, the author John does something with the Old Testament, and it isn't long before we get in the book where we hit our first one. That is verse 4. So Revelation 1:4 today. And I'm just going to read the first part of verse 4 because I want to focus on one particular thing in this episode. And then we're going to have Revelation 1:4, the remainder of it, and then a few other things in the next episode. I want to try to chop it up like that because, I think it's just easier to fixate on one particular thing, especially if in the case of this episode, there's just a lot to think about and talk about with respect to the phrase that we get in verse 4, and that is, the writer says, "Grace to you and peace from him who is, and who was, and who is to come." So there's our phrase for the day. That's our focus for the day. Not the rest of the verse, just that first part. And this is going to get repeated in verse 8, and we'll loop verse 8 in toward the end of the episode. Verse 8 says, the Revelation 1:8, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is, and who was, and who is to come, the Almighty." So a little bit tacked on to that, front and the back, but essentially that phrase, him who is, and who was, and who is to come. So, out of the gate, this wording may or may not bring some Old Testament things to mind for listeners, but scholars have certainly noticed it and spent a lot of time actually talking about it. So the first thing I want to comment on is that the phrase is unusual in certain respects. That's Aune. He has I think it's 3-volume commentary on the book of Revelation. So 3 separate volumes in the Word Biblical Commentary series. In volume 1, he writes this about the phrase. He says, "In Revelation, John refers to God only as my or his, that is Jesus, Father." So you have Revelation 1:6, 2:27, 3:5, so on. But here, in verse 4 of the first chapter, perhaps intentionally, he omits the designation Father from the greeting. In fact, he transforms this part of the traditional Christian salutation, grace to you and peace. That's how verse 4 begins. John transforms this part of the traditional Christian salutation by referring to God using this very elaborate set of 3 clauses, each of which functions as a divine title. Though unattested elsewhere in early Christian literature, this distinctive phrase occurs 3 times in Revelation. Here, verse 4, then verse 8 in chapter 1, and then Revelation 4:8. A shorter bipartite, 2-part formula, perhaps a more traditional form that John expanded, this is Greek, haon kai ha'ain, who is and who was. And that occurs twice, Revelation 11:17, Revelation 16:5. So the first thing to notice here is that John is apparently doing something deliberate, because the way he opens this book, okay, granted, it's not an epistle. It's not like a normal letter. Normally these would start, "Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ." I mean, Paul does this over and over and over again. So John alters that formula for the book of Revelation and has this 3-fold title: him who is, who was, and who is to come. So that's the first thing that's commentators have noticed, that it's a little bit different. So there must be a reason why. Okay, choice sort of suggests intention. So the next question that scholars typically ask is, well, what is John's source text for this? Is he getting it somewhere? And there's broad agreement here. Sean McDonough, who I think I alluded to in the introductory episode, he has a whole book on this, Yahweh, YHWH at Patmos, Patmos, which is where John is at, writing the book of Revelation. So Yahweh at Patmos, Revelation 1:4, in its Hellenistic and early Jewish setting. Okay, this is a paperback from Whiffenstock. It used to be expensive because it was his published dissertation, but it's a very technical book because it was his dissertation. He actually spends a lot of time on this whole thing, Revelation 1:4, that's the whole book. So there's a lot to consider here. We're not going to get into the weeds that deeply. But he writes toward the beginning of his book, he says, it has long been recognized that this description of God that John opens with is indebted to Jewish reflections on the name Yahweh, YHWH, the divine name, the tetragrammaton. In particular, it's a reference to reflection on the enigmatic words of Exodus 3:14, I am who I am. So if you look at John 1:4, the Greek there is haon, that's who is, him who is, kai ha'ain, and who was, and then kai ha erkomenos, and who is coming or who is to come. Exodus 3:14, you have ego eimi, I am, and you would think that the Septuagint translator would say, I am, and then have a relative pronoun, that, and then I am again. Ego eimi, and then a relative pronoun, then ego eimi. But that's not what he does. The Septuagint translator has ego eimi, I am, and then haon, I am the one who is. So, right away, scholars who are into, Greek, New Testament, originally written in Greek, and then the Septuagint, when they come across this wording, this opening of John, they're thinking, John is thinking about Exodus 3:14 here. And I think that's, I'm not going to differ with anybody here. That's on track. And really, it's certainly on track. And Beale, I think, has a really good point of evidence for this. So, again, scholars have reached a broad consensus here. John is drawing on the burning bush episode, I am that I am. Exodus 3:14 in the Septuagint. And that is secured by, if you remember our previous episode, our introductory episode to the book of Revelation, I told you we would be hitting one of these. We're going to be hitting several of these, but there's actually a solecism in Revelation 1:4. Remember, a solecism is a mistake. And in John's case, it's an intentional mistake of Greek grammar. You actually have one of these in Revelation 1:4, and it's important. Beale, in his Revelation commentary, he has this massive, New International Greek textual commentary on Revelation. He writes this. He says, again, the phrase, the whole phrase, if you go back to Revelation 1 in English, grace to you and peace from him who is and who was and who is to come. So from is where this is going to start. And that's the word apa. So apa haon kai ha'ain ka ha erkomenos. Beale says that phrase is one of the characteristic solecisms in the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation. Since, this is going to sound technical, but I'll parse it in a moment. Since a genitive construction should follow apa, the preposition. He actually says there are examples in manuscripts where scribes tried to correct John's apparent mistake by adding a genitive noun, theou, from God. So from God, the one who is and who, so that you actually get manuscripts where the scribes see that this isn't good Greek. And so they actually added words to have it make better sense. So, it's a solecism. This is a mistake in Greek style, in Greek grammar. But again, as we said in our introductory episode, people who have studied these in the book of Revelation have realized that these are intentional, and they are deliberately there to draw our attention to something. So Beale continues and he says, it would be a blunder, though, of modern thinking to judge this as a mistake of one who did not know his Greek very well. Here, as often elsewhere, commentators generally acknowledge that the quote-unquote incorrect grammar is intentional. Haon is probably taken directly from Exodus 3:14. Where it occurs twice as an explanation of the divine name Yahweh. And John keeps it in the nominative case. Haon is a nominative participle. John keeps it in the nominative case, even though it follows a preposition that, in Greek grammar, prepositions govern which case follows them, if it's a noun. And apa calls for a particular grammatical case, the genitive. But John says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to put Exodus 3:14 in Greek right in here, and I'm going to keep the form that it occurs in Exodus 3 in the Septuagint. And I know it's bad Greek. And people who know Greek well are going to be jarred by it. And that's good. because I want them to go back and see what form it was in Exodus 3:14. And they'll know that I want them to look. I'm actually, this is like a red flag planted in the text. There's a boo-boo here, and where would we see this particular form? I mean, John knows Greek everywhere else. Why is he doing this? Where would this particular wording be found? Back in Exodus 3:14, the burning bush. So John marries two things grammatically that don't go together, but it's his way again of drawing attention back to the source, and the source is Exodus 3:14. On in his commentary comments on this as well. He says the one who is, again a substantival participle from the verb eimi, to be, was among Greek-speaking Jews a popular name for God, ultimately derived from the phrase ego eimi haon. Okay, I am the one who is, in the Septuagint translate of the Hebrew phrase Ehya Asher Ehya, I am who I am, in Exodus 3:14. So Beale and On and a bunch of other commentators, they see what's going on here. And they see the fact that this is a quote-unquote mistake. But they also recognize that it's deliberate. John is telling you, essentially, where to look, where he got this. Third point, if you look at it, though, and when we compared them, let me just read it again here. Revelation 1:4, you have this longer phrase, the one who is and who was and who is to come. And in the first part of that, the one who is this Greek haon. Exodus 3:14 only has haon, ego eimi haon. It doesn't have the rest of what John's phrase is. It doesn't have any reference to who was and who is to come. That doesn't come from Exodus 3:14. So it raises the question, well, why does John supplement this? Why isn't Exodus 3:14 as it is good enough? Why does he add to it? Is it some kind of commentary on his part? Does it have some significance? And McDonough's, again, in his book on Revelation 1:4, his first and third chapters, are really aimed at trying to answer this question. And the first chapter frames the context for the whole question. So what he does in this first chapter is he surveys Greek literature, just, the whole of Greek literature from its beginnings all the way up through the Hellenistic period, which is the Second Temple Jewish period. And he finds a few near parallels to Revelation 1:4's wording in Homer and Hesiod. And the latter is with respect to the deeds of the gods. So here is Hesiod's theogony, again, with his cosmogony, his cosmology in there. Lines 29 through 34, he writes, "So said the ready-voiced daughters of great Zeus, and they plucked and gave me a rod, a shoot of sturdy laurel, a marvelous thing, and breathed into me a divine voice to celebrate things that shall be and things that were aforetime. They bade me sing of the race of the blessed gods that are eternally, macharon, genos, ion, anton, eternally there, but ever to sing of themselves both first and last." Now, in the English, you see a few phrases there in English. Things that shall be, things that were before. Then there's this reference to the gods who are eternal, and they sing of themselves first and last. Okay, I mean, some of this language you already know is in Revelation. So McDonough notes this and says, these phrases refer not only to the deeds of the gods, but really the gods themselves. And that seems, coherent. But none of this is an exact parallel to the Septuagint of Exodus 3:14 or John 1:4. But you get similar language about these other gods, the Greek gods. There's actually a closer parallel, though. A Greek writer, Pausanias, citing an oracle at Dodona, is the one that's really close. And this text is considered by scholars to be contemporaneous with the book of Revelation. So, first century when John's writing, or maybe a little bit before. And it describes Zeus. And here's the description. Zeus is described as Zeus was, Zeus is, Zeus shall be. Almighty Zeus. Zeus, of course, was considered at the time in the pagan world to be the Most High. The term houpsistos in Greek, which means Most High, is used of Zeus a lot. So the pagan world is thinking Zeus is the Most High deity. And he was, and he is, and he shall be. So as soon as you run into that, you're thinking, okay, it seems like John is taking a shot at the Greco-Roman Most High God, Zeus. I'm going to read a little something from DDD, Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible, about the term hypsistos. It says, this is a superlative form from the adverb hypsi, there again, which means high or highest or most high. You have the article up front, so it serves as a noun. So hypsistos, ha hypsistos, the most high. And it has the sense of most high or highest. In the Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, again, that would be the Septuagint, elyon, the Hebrew word elyon, is always translated by ha hypsistos, the most high. In these instances, as in the Greek literature of Judaism in the Second Temple period and in the literature of primitive Christianity, the expression ha hypsistos refers to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In non-Jewish or non-Christian texts written in Greek, the expression occurs as a divine name for Zeus. Okay, so it's the end of the quote. Did the Septuagint translator, it's a good question, did the Jew, who in the Hellenistic period, the guys who did the work translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek, did the guy who got Exodus, did he render the divine name in Exodus 3:14 the way he did to challenge the status of Zeus? I mean, because he who is, ego eimi, I myself am the one who is. Okay, is that a shot? Because what John does is John takes that and then he adds it. I mean, John makes it completely transparent because he adds the other two elements that he is. I mean, it's pretty evident if you were a Greek person, if you were a Gentile especially, but if you knew Greek well, you're familiar with this title. And John is not talking about Zeus here. He's talking about the God of Israel. He gives him this titling of Zeus, which ties in back to Exodus 3:14, the burning bush. So it seems that this is what John's doing. He's sort of laying down the gauntlet. And McDonough picks up on this point, and he says here, the stage has now been set for our investigation of the use and understanding of the name Yahweh in early Judaism. Again, this is part of his first chapter. We have seen that Greek thinking would have posed a considerable challenge to a reflective Jew or Christian in the Hellenistic era. The Greeks were in control of the world. And this is the era, post-Alexander here. The Greeks were in control of the world, which might raise the question as to whether their gods were likewise in control of the world. What is more, the chief of their pantheon, Zeus, had undergone a transformation which rendered him a considerable foe for any god claiming supremacy over the universe. No longer simply the lustful tyrant of Homeric days, Homer's epics. Zeus now came as the embodiment of the Stoic designing fire, or as the one through whom all things have life. That's another title of Zeus. That actually sounds like descriptions of Jesus elsewhere in the New Testament. But this is how Zeus is described. And McDonough continues, as they sang at Dodona, Zeus was, Zeus is, and Zeus will be. The name Yahweh, we will see, was ready to enter the etymological fray as the one who is. But this in turn led back to the questions posed by Greek philosophers about the nature of being and its relationship to time and space. Yahweh's confrontation with the gods of the nations was about to take a new turn. So again, this is McDonough and other commentators are thinking what John's doing here is, in fact, not just, hey, remember hey, you readers who might have some acquaintance with Judaism. I'm using this phrase now and I'm committing a grammatical error so that you go look and find Exodus 3:14. Oh, well, okay, the same God of Exodus 3:14, the same God of the burning bush is the God that John's writing about now. Well, that's all true. John wants people to see that, but he wants more. So he supplements it. It's not only the he who is, but he who was and who was to come. And when he adds those two elements, it's a swipe at Zeus. So now he's looping the pagans in too, and anybody else in the Jewish community who might be familiar with how pagans looked at Zeus and how Zeus was set as a rival or better than Yahweh. So just this one little selection from Exodus 3:14, and then supplementing it a little bit, giving it a little more play, is actually, again, theological telegraphing. It's significant. So just to go on here, McDonough mentions Philo. So Philo actually uses this phrase as well, ha'on, the one who is. So just, I want to get into this a little bit. So one of the possible, not just the solecism, the grammatical, mistake, points back to Exodus 3:14, this fundamental text in Judaism. But Philo, a very famous, first century BC writer, he takes that from Exodus 3:14 as well, and he writes within the context of Second Temple Judaism, Hellenistic Judaism. He uses this description as Yahweh's name. Now you have to realize this has significance because this is also the era when, for Jews, they begin to be very hesitant to use the name of God. Now this notion is very familiar to people who listen to this podcast, who are Bible students, evangelicals, whatever. This notion about you couldn't pronounce the name of the Lord. Well, I hope you realize, in the Old Testament period, that wasn't actually the case. I mean, Exodus 3 actually requires people to say the name of God. I mean, let's just go back to Exodus 3, just a quick rabbit trail here. Because again, we know all about this notion that Jews didn't pronounce the name. Well, that really is something that comes from the Second Temple period. And scholars speculate on reasons for it. But in the biblical period, people were saying the divine name all the time. Now just look, I'm going back to the burning bush here. And here's what Moses says. Verse 13. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, hey, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask, what's his name? What shall I say to them? And God tells him what to say. Here's what you say, Moses. God said to Moses, I am who I am. Ehya, Asher, Ehya. Okay, I am who I am. Say to this people, I am, Ehya, has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, now catch this, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord. Okay, and that's Yahweh. That's the third person form. Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. So God actually demands that Moses use his name if he gets asked this question. And then you have the priestly blessing, like in the book of Numbers. This is Numbers 6, 22 and 27. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, thus you shall bless the people of Israel. You, high priest, Aaron, you shall say to them. And this isn't like a whisper, and he's not writing it out and handing it out, and don't utter it, just read it. No, he says, you say to them, Yahweh, there's the divine name. The Lord bless you and keep you. Yahweh, make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh, lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So shall they put my name upon the people of Israel, and I will bless them. These are just two instances. My point is that, it's not a myth that Jews didn't want to say the name of God. That's true. But that whole hesitance, that reticence, really is something that you begin to see in the very period where John is writing the book of Revelation, and he's using what then, according to the literature we have, he's using sort of the conventional way or the literary way to use God's name verbally to people, and that is ha'on, the one who is. Okay, in Greek, because everybody speaks Greek. Philo, going back to McDonough's book here, Philo points this out McDonough points this out about Philo, that he uses this as God's quote unquote, proper name. And when Philo also says elsewhere that God has no real name, he has no proper name, he just is. But he uses this sort of as a way to speak of God and utter his name in Greek. And everybody was, there was nothing unusual about this. It's okay. Philo was never labeled a blasphemer or anything like that. And of course, neither is John. Owen comments on Philo. He says, Philo often uses the phrase haon of God, sometimes in combination with theos, the word for God. For example, haon theos, the God who is, or haontos, on theos, the God who truly is. Philo will use these phrases. The phrase haon is used at least 8 times in Philo as a divine name. Then he lists the references and so on and so forth. And half of them very certainly come directly from Exodus 3:14. So, we're not going to rabbit trail as to why Jews became hesitant to use the name, but it was important that they did it in this way, at least. And John does it. John uses the name, but he does it in Greek. He does the Greek form of Exodus 3:14, haon, the one who is. And again, that there's nothing wrong with that. He wasn't blaspheming or anything, because he wants people, again, to recognize that we're talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Moses, the God of the burning bush, so on and so forth. And he thinks it's important enough to start his book this way. And the book's going to be read orally. So people are going to hear haon. And if you're Jewish, I can't listen to that because that's the name of God. Even though it's Greek, that's the name of God, and we're not allowed to hear it. No, it's not like that. Now, in terms of the Hebrew terminology, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you do get the divine name written in a lot of scrolls. Some of the scrolls don't write it. The scribes don't write it. They put like 4 dots in its place. Some of them write it and put dots over and under it. They do all sorts of things. Aramaic, they typically use the word mar, which means Lord. And the Septuagint does that a lot, mostly. It'll use kurios instead of trying to transliterate the term in Greek. But some manuscripts try to transliterate. If you know the Greek alphabet, you will see a capital letter I and then a capital pi, which looks like, the I is 1 column, the pi is 2 columns, and then another capital letter I, and then another one with 2 columns. It looks like 6 columns in a row in capital letter Greek. But it spells from left to right. It spells Pippi, P-I-P-I. That's actually a divine name in some Greek manuscripts, because the Greek writer is trying to use Greek capital letters to create something that looks like the YHWH in Hebrew. They do all sorts of things to either veil the divine name, or in some cases they will use Exodus 3:14 so that they can say it. And in John's case, it's important because he not only takes that out of Exodus 3:14, or excuse me, Exodus 3:14 into Revelation 1:4, but then he supplements it again as apparently a swipe at Zeus, who was considered most high in his time, in the Greek-speaking world. So what do we have, to this point? I think, what we have as it pertains to the Old Testament is, again, the use of Exodus 3:14 to link what John is going to write about, the God of, it's not just the God of John, okay? It's the God of Christians. It's the God of, not only Israel, but the God of Christians, the God of those who follow Jesus. It's the same God. And this God is most high. But for John, he's more. It's not just that this is the God of Exodus 3 and the burning bush and so on and so forth. Because this God became a man in Jesus. Okay, the Most High became a man in Jesus and died and rose again. And this is the center of the Christian faith. And it's going to be the center of the book of Revelation. It's going to be the center of, who he's writing about. And this is why verse 8 becomes important. So if it was just verse 4, the one who is and who was and who is to come, and that's the God of Israel back at the burning bush. And John's supplemented because he wants to take a swipe at Zeus. That's good stuff. But now we get to verse 8, where God, the one who is and who was and who is to come, God says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty. So we have the same threefold description as in 1:4, but here it's linked to I am the Alpha and Omega, which will later be explained as, like as if we couldn't tell, as meaning I'm the first and the last. It's Revelation 21:6, Revelation 22:13. Now, we may not realize it, but when John adds that, I'm the first and the last in those references, and we'll get to him down the road, but we'll say something here as well. John's dipping into the Old Testament there too. Isaiah 41:4. Okay, let's just, give you some examples here of how, John with these other phrases is also thinking about the Old Testament. He's also repurposing it. And it's going to become significant. We'll get to this why in a moment. But in Isaiah 41:4, we read, "Who has performed and done this, calling the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, the first, and with the last, I am he." Isaiah 43:10, "You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me, and understand that I am he. Before me no God was formed, nor shall there be any after me." Isaiah 44:6, "Thus says the Lord, the King of Israel, and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, I am the first, I am the last, besides me there is no God." Isaiah 48:12, "Listen to me, O Jacob and Israel, whom I called. I am he, I am the first, and I am the last." I like Isaiah 43:10 is the big one. I reference these in Unseen Realm. Yes, there are plural Elohim and all that stuff, but before God, there was no other. He has to create the other ones. And after him, no one else is going to be creating them. Okay, he is the lone creator. He is the lone self-existent. He is the lone pre-existent. He is the lone eternal. Nothing else, even in the spiritual world, can claim these attributes. I mean, these are really important, powerful phrases. But the point for our purposes here is you get the first and last language looped into this. And Beale comments on this, and he says the complete threefold clause, the one who is, who was, and who is to come, is a reflection of Exodus 3:14 together with twofold and threefold temporal descriptions of God in Isaiah. So, even if we didn't have the Old Testament, with this additional stuff in verse 8, back in verse 4, it's very clear that John's taken a swipe at Zeus. And if there was any ambiguity as to which deity John prefers, the who was and who is to come, okay, the first and the last. He was the first one on the stage, and he's going to be the last one. That whole kind of thing. If you start looking for that language and you find it, you run into it in verse 8. And you go back to the Old Testament there, you're going to run into the same God, the God of Moses, the God of the burning bush, the God of Israel. So go back to Beale, he says, we have these threefold temporal descriptions of God in Isaiah, which themselves may be developed reflections on the divine name in Exodus 3:14. The name in Exodus 3:14 was also expanded in twofold and threefold manners in later Jewish tradition. I am now what I always was and always will be. That's some midrash, it's some rabbinic writings there from Rabbi Akiba. I am he who is and who was, and I am he who will be. That's Deuteronomy 32:39 in a Targum, the Targum specifically Pseudo-Jonathan, which is later. Again, this is the rabbinic period. But you can see how the Jewish community is putting Exodus 3 together with some of these other verses. Now, there's a practical point to John's strategy. Beale explains elsewhere. He says, all these expansions are used in their respective contexts to describe God, not merely as present at the beginning, the middle, and the end of history, but as the incomparable, sovereign Lord over history, who is thus able to bring prophecy to fulfillment. John's going to talk a lot about that in Revelation. He is able to bring prophecy to fulfillment and to deliver his people despite overwhelming odds, whether from Egypt, Babylon, or the nations, which would, of course, in John's day be the Greeks and the Romans. In Revelation, the last part of the threefold clause, ha erchomenos, okay, the one who is to come, is to be understood eschatologically and as referring to God's sovereign consummation of history in the future. End of quote. So in other words, John wants readers to know that the God of Moses, the God of Israel, who is and was and is coming, the first and the last, will deliver believers under persecution, because that's who he's writing to. These churches are in a difficult spot. It's toward the end of the first century, or in the middle of the first century, and the church is under persecution from the Jewish community mostly, but later it's going to ramp up with the Romans. John wants them to know that he will deliver believers under persecution. God is capable of doing this as he delivered the remnant of Israel in the past. So that, again, there's the connection point. And more than that, for John, this God became a man in Jesus Christ. And John will specifically link his description of God in Revelation 1:4a, the first part of verse 4, and verse 8. He actually links these descriptions. Okay, think about it. The one who is, who was, and who is to come, the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega. As you're reading Revelation 1, verse 4, oh, that's God. Verse 8, oh, that's God. Verse 17, that ain't God. Okay. Revelation 1:17 says this. Now let's go back up to verse 12. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me. And on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze. I mean, these are descriptions you can find in the Old. We're going to hit more of this, but just generally now, you can find this imagery used of the God of Israel in the Old Testament. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace. And his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and from his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword. And his face was like the sun shining in full strength. And when I saw him, I fell at his feet, though dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, "Fear not. I am the first and the last." Now, if it stopped there, verse 17, you'd think, oh yeah, that's the God back in verse 4 and back in verse 8. But it continues in verse 18. So I am the first and the last and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore. And I have the keys of death and Hades. See, now we're not talking about God the Father here. This is Jesus. And the language overlaps with verse 4 and verse 8. And it'll overlap later too. So, I mean, John, again, wants to make certain claims. And with this, we'll wrap up today. He's telling them, look, the same God who delivered the Israelites from Egypt, who delivered them from Babylon. Okay, this same God, the burning bush. He's still God. He's still our God. He's not just the God of Israel. He's the God of all believers, all those who believe in his Messiah, Jesus. And not only that, but this God, again, is also Jesus. Okay, he became a man, he died, and he rose again. Okay, I was dead, I died. Okay, I'm the first and the last. Just like the first and the last back in verse 8. Who is the Almighty? Who is the one who is and who was and who is to come? John is mixing the language here and applying it to both the Father and the Son. Okay, so, and by the way, for those of you who, God forbid, do internet theology, this is another one of those things that nobody's going to say Revelation was written like way late. It's at the end of the 1st century at the latest. Here's your Christology. Okay, it doesn't have to wait to Nicaea, is the point. Okay, this is Christology long before the Council of Nicaea. It is describing Jesus the way you would describe God, and you do it to both in the same chapter in the span of like 10 verses. Okay? So John wants people to know this about, God is able to deliver them. It's the same God who became a man, who's Christ, and so on and so forth. And he is the Most High. So right out of the gate, John is making a theological statement. And he wants his readers, his hearers, to know that this same God, even though they're under persecution, this is the God who has the keys to life and death. Okay? To death and Hades, so on and so forth. Everlasting life or everlasting death. And this one is on their side, the side of the believer. So again, John does what he does through, I don't want to call it clever, but maybe not completely transparent ways that he marries Exodus 3:14 to some passages in Isaiah and uses them to take a swipe at Greco-Roman religion. I mean, John has a reason for doing with the Old Testament what he's doing here, to communicate all of these theological thoughts and to encourage people he knows that are going to be listening to the book or reading the book in their situation. And away we go, because the rest of the book, he's going to pick up speed and start talking about the end of days, the final resolution of all things. And he wants them to know who's on their side.
All right, Mike. First one in the books. First one in the books. Yeah. How do you feel about it? You feel good?
Good. Yeah. I mean, I like, I'm going to have a predilection for things that John's going to do that aren't sort of surface level transparent from English. Parts of this were and parts of it weren't. So I kind of like that. You get a sense that he's doing something, but don't quite know exactly what he's doing. There are other places that are going to be like when we hit the plagues and he starts, talking about the plagues and it's going to sound like Egypt. Well, that's a little more transparent than some of this. But, I think anybody who's reading the book of Revelation closely will have a sense, if they've read through the Old Testament a few times, that he's doing something there. But exactly what, again, that's why we're here. That's why we're doing the series.
Do you foresee yourself learning anything new, Mike, going through this?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I've never systematically gone through Revelation. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there something you're looking forward to more than the others, or it's just all good?
No, to me, it's like, some of the stuff we did leading up to this, like with the Gospels, in my dissertation, you get references, because I had to read about, Jewish binitarian Christology all the time. So I had hints of what was sort of lurking in the Gospels, in that regard. But a lot of those episodes we did, there was some of this, of the Christology stuff, like pre-existence, for instance. But there were other things that, I had never, taken a look at, like how Jesus handles the Old Testament, specifically to telegraph Gentile inclusion and things like that. So I enjoy, doing this kind of thing because I like connectivity just in general. And so this gets my head, in those cases, it gets my head more into the Gospels. In this case, it'll be the book of Revelation. Yep, we find ourselves still in Revelation 1, as Trey just said, and we're still in verse 4. At least we will be a little bit. We covered a lot in verse 4 last time, specifically the phrase who is and who was and who is to come. There's some things still in verse 4 that I want to say something about, and then move into verses 5 and 6. So that's where we're going to camp out today, really, Revelation 1, 4 through 6. And I'm just going to read verse 4 to get us started here. It says that John is writing to the 7 churches that are in Asia. Grace to you and peace from him who is and who was and who is to come, and from the 7 spirits who are before his throne. So to launch here, we want to talk about the 7 churches and the 7 spirits. It's transparently obvious John is writing to 7 churches, and then he throws in this line about the 7 spirits who are before his throne, God's throne. So if you just looked at this verse, it doesn't connect these spirits, even though, they're both 7 churches, 7 spirits. So you sort of intuitively, connect them mentally anyway. The verse doesn't actually do that. So it raises the question, well, who are the 7 spirits before the throne of God? Later in the chapter, we're going to get a little more information. That's where connections are made, and we're going to get there, because we're not going to stay in verses 4 through 6. We're going to have to, jump out a little bit into verses 12 through 16 to help us understand, what's in 4 through 6, specifically. But we'll get to that in a moment. If you keep reading into the book of Revelation, you run into some things that contribute to what we did just read in verse 4, this whole thing about the 7 churches and the 7 spirits. So if you keep reading, when you hit verse 12, you're going to run into another 7, 7 golden lampstands, Revelation 1:12. So as we'll see, these are actually better understood as menorah branches. Like if you can think of a menorah, lamp in your head, these would be the branches actually. So these are actually 7 menorah branches, not like 7 separate lamp posts, to use sort of a modern description. And in verse 16, we run into 7 again. This time it's 7 stars in the right hand of the glorified Son of Man. So, we've got these 7s. Now, in verse 16, the 7 stars are identified as angels of the seven churches. So the seven stars are actually seven angels, and they are connected here. In verse 16 it starts, but when you get to verse 20, it's even more specific. So really from verse 12, verse 16, and verse 20, you put all those together, read and go back and read verse 4, and this is where you start to get the connection. So we've got seven stars identified as angels of the seven churches in verses 16 and 20. The seven lampstands are identified as the seven churches, also in verse 20. And if you keep reading again, in Revelation 3:1, he who has the seven stars in his hand, that's the glorified Son of Man from Revelation 1:16, is also said to have the seven spirits. That's language from Revelation 1:4. And that implies that the seven spirits of 1:4 are in fact these stars who are angels of the seven churches. So all of these things are connected, and there's actually a good deal to support John making these connections, using these images together collectively and intertwining them. There's actually a good deal of precedent for that in Second Temple Jewish literature. I'll just give you one example from Beale's commentary here. He writes, a similar phenomenon, again, all these elements, is traceable in 1 Enoch 90, verses 20 through 25, where the seven white ones who are in that passage identified as angels and are also mentioned with 70 stars, again, also identified with angels. So 1 Enoch 90 does this, and it's based on the context of things that, the writer of 1 Enoch found in the book of Daniel. You have imagery in Daniel 7, verse 10, Daniel 9, 2 and 24, and Daniel 12. I mean, this star language, this celestial language. Also in 1 Enoch 21:3, Beale says, there are seven stars that are equivalent to seven angels. He writes, this evidence suggests that these stars here in Revelation are heavenly angelic beings. And then he references a few other passages in 1 Enoch. 1 Enoch 86:1-3 and 88:1, where stars also symbolize angels. So, again, there's precedent for this. And just by way of a quick summary, we've got in verse 4, seven churches that are in Asia. We have seven spirits who are before God's throne. And then if we keep reading verses 12, 16, and 20, these seven stars are identified as angels. The seven lampstands are the seven churches. Okay, and the stars are also the seven spirits. So they're also angels. I mean, and John is drawing this, as Beale noted of 1 Enoch, from a number of passages. I mean, John knows all this stuff in Daniel. He knows about the star language in Daniel and elsewhere where you have angels identified as stars. And but now he's looping in lampstands and all this other stuff. So it's already feeling a bit convoluted. Like can't John just cite an Old Testament verse like close to its entirety and just talk about it and move on? And the answer is no. No, he just doesn't do that. And we talked about this in the introduction. I'm going to keep bringing this up at least for the first few episodes we do in this series, that this is not what John does. John has thoughts, running through his head, or in putting him in the context of the vision. He sees things, and his mind is so filled with lots of the Old Testament that he just starts picking things off the shelf to describe for his reader what it is that he's seeing and also what it means, telegraphing what the imagery is pointing to. And it is not as easy as a verse by verse citation. He just throws it all into the blender. Okay. So to this point, we've got seven spirits who are stars, who are angels, identified with seven churches, also called lampstands. We also have, let's not forget Jesus in all this. Jesus, the glorified Son of Man, is, quote, in their midst. Okay. And that is the wording of Revelation 1:13. Now, again, the Son of Man language is easy to see, and we're gonna hit it now, and we're gonna hit it in the next episode as well. And you should all know, at least most of the listeners in this audience are going to know it comes from Daniel 7, where the Son of Man gets the deity epithet, the one who rides on the clouds and comes with the clouds. Daniel 7 as well features the Ancient of Days, hair and clothing white as snow, pure wool with a throne of fire. Now, I'm going to go back just before we get, a little, too far into this, much more anyway. I'm going to read you just so that it's in your head. I mean, a lot of it already is, and I know that because, we're familiar with our audience here. But I'm going to read, in case we have, new listeners who aren't as, tuned into Daniel 7 as most of you are. I'm going to read Revelation 1, 12 through 16. So we got verse 4. You got the 7 spirits and the 7 churches, all right? Then we hit verse 12. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me. And on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands. So there's that. And in the midst of the lampstands, in their midst, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. And you already know that isn't from Daniel 7. And again, we'll get to all these details either in this or the subsequent episode. In verse 14, the hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow, his eyes like a flame of fire. That's verse 14. And you know that, well, in Daniel 7, that's the language about the Ancient of Days, not the Son of Man. You're correct. Why is John mixing the two? Again, just hold on. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. If you think, that sounds a little bit like Ezekiel, about chapter 1, chapter 43. Yeah, it does. Again, John is throwing it all into the blender. Verse 16, in his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. And then when you get down to verse 20, as for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. So this is what's in the hopper, and it's going to take more than just one episode to get through this. You can already see that John is not merely alluding to passages like Daniel 7. He's including material from other passages, again, throwing into the blender is my metaphor. And he's applying the language in ways that the original passage didn't. If you go back to Daniel 7, you have the Ancient of Days. Well, that's God. You have the Son of Man who comes with or on the clouds. Again, most of this audience is going to know that's a deity epithet. So the Son of Man is also deity. They're also going to know that this cloud riding motif thing gets applied to Yahweh, the God of Israel, 4 times in the Old Testament. This is the 5th occurrence, and this time it's not applied to Yahweh. It's applied to the Son of Man instead. But, John takes the language about the Ancient of Days, at least part of his description, and applies it to the Son of Man, which Daniel 7 doesn't do. I mean, this is what we're dealing with. This is what we're dealing with. John throws lots of stuff in the blender, and what comes out doesn't necessarily conform to the way you found it or how you found it in the source texts. Now, conceptually, theologically, John, in this case especially, A, is allowed to do that because the theology is consistent. And B, John is feels very free to exalt Jesus to the level of Yahweh of Israel. And so that's also why you get some of this mixing. I mean, John's gospel, it does this all the time. This is what it's known for, high Christology. So this is John's method, if you can call it a method. I like this passage, this passage, this passage. This has something to do with what's going on in my head or in front of my eyes. And we're going to throw it all into the blender and watch what comes out. Again, it's not just easy citations. Now, on the surface, if you're reading in Revelation 1 and, so you see all these 7s and then you run into the exalted Son of Man who is Jesus, and even though he's described like the Ancient of Days, well, that makes sense because Jesus is God anyway. Okay, all of this is setup. All of this is context. What follows in chapters 2 and 3. That's where you get the letters to the 7 churches in Asia Minor. So we know it's context, okay? It's all leading somewhere. And initially where it leads are these letters. And honestly, you could hear that much in church because it's so obvious. But there's so much more that's going on here. It's hard really to know what to take first, and you'll soon sort of discern why. Because John, again, doesn't cite things just neatly and in order. He's not like tracking on a passage in order. And just throw out the word orderly. okay, when you're thinking of John's method here, what he does in the book of Revelation with the Old Testament. What John does is messy. Okay, and what's happening here in Revelation 1 is sort of a classic illustration of how John alludes not only to, in this case, Zechariah 4, we're going to go there in a moment, but that passage, when he lands there and he pulls something out of that passage alludes to other passages, Zechariah 1, Zechariah 3. I mean, it's just this like follow the bouncing ball, kind of thing. And also Daniel 7. So, John is just throwing all this together. John ultimately draws upon, 3 or 4 Old Testament passages instead of simply citing an Old Testament reference and then leaving it at that. He just doesn't do that. He alludes to material in several passages and combines what he uses. And then he more or less leaves it to the reader to figure out why he's doing it. Now, I'm going to leave, for the sake of this episode, I'm going to leave the Son of Man material specifically for the next episode or a future episode. So we're not going to spend much time in Daniel 7 in this episode at all. Instead, we're going to be spending a lot of time in the Zechariah passages. So as a way to get there, let's start with the 7 spirits and the 7 stars and the 7 lampstands and the 7 churches. So despite what seems like a simple symmetry, okay, the angels are the spirits and the churches are the lampstands, okay? Seems simple enough. Despite the symmetry of that and the fact that John is writing to 7 historical churches, these are churches that actually existed, many scholars, and it might be fair to say most, would consider these letters not to have been written merely, that's an important word, merely, to those 7 historical churches, but all churches, all bodies of believers, everywhere, for all time. And that second thought, this universalizing of the language here doesn't seem to make too much sense. It doesn't seem logical since we know that these churches existed and there's all the 7 symmetry. It must be obvious John is isolating what he's saying to these 7. Well, not really, because there are other things that he's doing that make it a little more apparent that he's casting a wider net. And the thinking in that regard that scholars have, that what we really have is a wider net being cast here. They're led to think that because of where John goes in the Old Testament. So we just looked at Revelation 1, 12 through 16, where you get the lampstand imagery. And that takes us to verse 20. Okay, we just did that. Ultimately, though, this is going to take us back into the Old Testament and specifically Zechariah 4. So if we ask what we've read to this point, hey, what's up with these 7 lampstands that I run into in verse 12? I got the spirit and the spirits and the churches and the stars and the angels, and what's up with the lampstands? So if we start there, and again, I'm just being a bit arbitrary. I'm looking for entry points here because it is messy. If we ask that question first, they are, it turns out, an allusion to Zechariah 4, 1 and 2. And so I'm going to read Zechariah 4, those first 2 verses here, to get us into it. We read in Zechariah 4, 1 and 2, "And the angel who talked with me," this is Zechariah writing or speaking, "the angel who talked with me came again and woke me, like a man who is awakened out of his sleep. And he said to me, 'What do you see?' And I said, 'I see, and behold, a lampstand all of gold, with a bowl on the top of it, and 7 lamps on it, with 7 lips on each of the lamps that are on top of it.'" I'm going to stop there, because that's where the lampstand imagery comes from. If I kept reading, though, well, let's just loop this in. Again, it's messy, so we're just sort of playing it by ear a little bit here. If you keep going to verse 10, it says, the angel, and boy, do we need to talk about that. And a lot of that we're going to save for next episode as well. Like what's up? What is this, a special angel? Is it, which angel is this? Okay, that's a whole different question. So the angel's trying to explain this to Zechariah, and he says, "For whoever," this is verse 10, "for whoever has despised the day of small things shall rejoice, and shall see the plumb line in the hand of Zerubbabel. These 7," He's referring back to the lamp, the branches of the menorah here. These 7 are the eyes of the Lord, which range through the whole earth. Okay, that's kind of cryptic. Thanks for that. What are we supposed to do with that? So we've got 7. We got a lampstand with 7 branches. Again, this is where John, gets this language back in Revelation, and those 7 menorah lamps are the eyes of the Lord, which range through the whole earth. Okay. Now we have to think about this description a little bit. Eyes of the Lord, which range through the whole earth. Now, typically scholars have understood this, and I think it's coherent for a number of reasons, but we're just looking for an entry point here. Typically, they've understood these branches in light of this metaphor, the eyes of the Lord, as representing God's omniscience and knowledge. And it makes sense because the metaphor is one where you have light, it's a lamp. These are branches of a lamp. So light penetrates or removes darkness, so that what is hidden is revealed. I mean, it makes sense, So if these are the eyes of the Lord, it refers to the fact that God sees beyond the darkness. It doesn't obscure his vision. It doesn't hinder his knowledge, of everything that's going on. More to the point for us, though, is the whole earth language. These are the eyes of the Lord, which range through the whole earth. So if this language that John is using in Zechariah 4 really expands to the whole earth, that's why interpreters of Revelation presume that the 7 spirits, stars, lampstands, angels are also to be universalized. That is, what's going on in Revelation 1 through 3 should not be restricted to those 7 churches, but churches in general. I mean, that this message is for every church everywhere. The language is representative of believers and churches everywhere. This is why scholars go this direction. Now, we're not done talking about the lampstands or the branches here. They go throughout the whole earth. John has these branches, though, as the churches whose angels are spirits or spirits are in view. Another reason why, again, this identification sort of makes sense. Again, I'm trying to make sense of John's logic here, and really, Zechariah's logic as well. It's obvious that human beings can't see what's going on in the whole outer world, but spiritual beings can. So the eyes are more properly the spirits who are associated with the churches. Okay, did you follow that logic? Because in Revelation 1, the 7 spirits who are before the throne of God are linked to the churches. You say, well, how can that be universalized? Because churches are made up of people, and people can't see things everywhere. And if they're God's agents, they're still people, and they can't see things everywhere. Aha, you're correct. But that's why we have the spirits connected with the churches, because spiritual beings can see beyond human sight. And since these are the eyes of the Lord that go throughout the whole earth, we should not be reading Revelation 1 through 3 restrictively. Yes, individual churches are the localized manifestations of not only the people of God, but also God's presence. Let's not forget that churches also have something to do with God's presence. So it would make sense for God's presence to also be accompanied by spirits, i.e. angels. Okay, if you're starting to think, this is kind of sounding divine counsel-ish here, you're correct. Okay, you're correct. In New Testament theology, churches and believers are God's temple, God's house, where God lives. And where God lives, so does his spiritual entourage reside. Okay, if you're thinking already, that, like, wow, out of this language and John's use of Zechariah 4, we've got sort of a divine counsel family where that spiritual counsel family is blended with humans. We've got that sort of imagery going on here. We've got actually divine counsel-ish imagery going on here. And guess what? If you loop the Son of Man into it, isn't that logical too? Because Daniel 7 is a divine council meeting. The court sat and the books were opened, Daniel 7. If you're thinking and suspecting all of that, you're on the right track. You're on the right track. In other words, the pieces disassembled look kind of crazy. They look like they don't belong together, but when you start to think of them theologically, the pieces actually paint or come together as a coherent picture. Isn't that marvelous? It's like John knows what he's doing. It's like he knows how to build a mosaic that telegraphs the idea of God's presence in his house with his spiritual family and his spiritual agents being united to, married to, associated with his human agents, and humans are his sacred space. It's where he dwells now. It's like John knows all this stuff, and he's putting it together, and he's going to do something with it. Again, if you're suspecting that, you're correct. You are on to something. Now, I want to spend a little bit more time on eyes of the Lord, eyes of Yahweh, just to show that this isn't Mike sucking this out of the passage because Mike wrote Unseen Realm. Okay, as I have said on hundreds of occasions, nothing in Unseen Realm is unique to Mike. Okay, yeah, I am a sifter and a dot connector. That's what I do. And I don't have to make up the dots. The dots are there in the text, and I look to other scholars to help me see dots so I can make connections. And other scholars make connections too. So let's camp a little bit on Zechariah 4. Okay, and Zechariah 4, 1 and 2, and verse 10 as well, this whole eyes of the Lord thing. So I'm going to read it again because Zechariah is not like a passage anybody has memorized. The angel of the Lord who talked with me came again and woke me, like a man who was awakened out of his sleep. And he said to me, "What do you see?" I said, "I see, and behold, a lampstand all of gold, with a bowl on the top of it, and 7 lamps on it with 7 lips on each of the lamps that are on top of it." And it's a menorah. And then you go down to verse 10, where the angel informs Zechariah, these 7 branches here, these lamps, these 7 are the eyes of the Lord, which range through the whole earth. Okay. Now, Eric and Carol Myers, they wrote they've actually got a 2-volume commentary in the Anchor Bible series on Zechariah 1 through 8. It also includes Haggai. But in their first volume, when they are commenting on this passage, they write this: the eyes of the Yahweh. This expression is analogous to the 7 eyes of God as reflected in Zechariah 3:9. Zechariah 3:9. Let's just go there quickly. Zechariah 3:9, for behold, on the stone that I have set before Joshua the high priest, and that is a divine council scene. Again, we're not going to drift over into that one yet. Behold, on the stone that I have set before Joshua, on a single stone with 7 eyes, I will engrave its inscription, declares the Lord, and I will remove the iniquity of this land in a single day. So we've got a stone with 7 eyes. These 7 eyes are eyes that God puts there, okay? So the Myers, Eric and Carol Myers, say this expression, eyes of the Lord, is analogous to the 7 eyes of God, because he's the one who puts them there, as reflected in Zechariah 3:9, where it is a metaphoric expression in an oracular context for God's omniscience and omnipresence. Now, that's interesting, but we like more detail here. So I have an article called The Eyes of the Lord, which is obviously an appropriate topic. It was written in 1968 by A. Leo Oppenheim in the Journal of the American Oriental Society. It's volume 88. He spends 7 or 8 pages on this, The Eyes of the Lord. Now, I want you to listen to what he writes here, because this is basically a study of the phrase in its ancient Near Eastern context. He writes, we know of these eyes of the Lord from a passage in 2 Chronicles 16:9, which is quite explicit about their working and their purpose. Quote, for the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong in the behalf of those whose heart is perfect towards him, unquote. The eyes have, as the seer Hanani points out here to Asa, king of Judah, the eyes have discovered the king's wrongdoing, and now God is to punish him on the basis of the information the eyes have relayed to him. Let me just stop there. You can already see, obviously, that eyes of the Lord is a metaphor for God knowing things. Okay, God's omniscience. Oppenheim continues, but the prophet's imagination, here in Zechariah, seems to have been sparked by several heterogeneous concepts and images. He uses the following words, quote, I saw by night. He's going to quote Zechariah 1 here. I saw by night, and behold, a man riding on a red horse. And he stood among the myrtle trees that were in the bottom, and behind him were the red horses speckled in white. That's Zechariah 1:8. And then later the mysterious writer explains, quote, these are they who the Lord has sent to walk to and fro through the earth. That's Zechariah 1:10. Sounds like Zechariah 4:10, but it's actually a different verse. Oppenheim continues, the next verse tells us quite explicitly what these mysterious night-riding spies of the Lord are supposed to report. Quote, we have walked to and fro through the earth, and behold, all the earth sitteth still and is at rest. That's verse 11. In another vision, Zechariah sees these men not on horseback, but on chariots, and elaborates on their activities and appearances in a clearly mythological vein. 4 such chariots are coming out, quote, between the 2 mountains of brass, unquote, in which we have to see the entrance to the heaven, and the same cosmic locality characterized by 2 mountains between which, in Mesopotamian and related cosmologic representations, the sun god comes forth and enters heaven every day. So he cites a Mesopotamian parallel idea. Then he quotes Zechariah 6:5, quote, these are the 4 spirits of the heavens, which should go forth from standing before the Lord, unquote. An order is given to them, quote, get hence, walk to and fro through the earth. That's Zechariah 6:7, so 2 verses later. Oppenheim continues, this they do on their chariots drawn by horses of different colors, each toward one point of the compass. It seems that these riders and charioteers start their rounds at night and are to roam the earth until morning, when they report on what they have seen, standing again before the Lord. We have tried to trace the recurring allusions to the restlessness of these ever-observant demonic, he has, basically he's using it as a spiritual, like daimonic here. Observant demonic or celestial beings, the eyes of the Lord. Daimon, again, spiritual being. This search is bound to bring to one's mind the familiar passage from the prologue to the book of Job, when the sons of God come before the Lord, and when Satan is asked, whence comest thou? And he answers, from going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. That's Job 1:7, Job 2:2. This particular Satan, does in the service of the Lord, and for explicit purpose of watching over people. In fact, he is supposed to know them by name. I'm going to just end the quote there. So again, you've heard me both in Unseen Realm and just various things on the podcast talk about Satan, that he's basically doing his job. And God asked him, hey, where have you been? Oh, I've been going to and fro throughout. He's one of these guys. He's a spiritual being assigned to go see who's obeying God or not. What's going on. So I'm going to try to simplify here. Oppenheim does a nice job of giving us the context of a phrase like the eyes of the Lord with supernatural beings who are watching people. Okay? This is an expression of God's omniscience, but the extension of that omniscience seems to be that the eyes of the Lord are God's heavenly agents who watch and keep watch. They do both. They watch and keep watch over people. The eyes are the spirits of God's presence. They report right back to God. It's no wonder that John associates with the menorah light branches. Again, light gets rid of darkness. It enables sight, all right, for us. It's no wonder that John associates with the menorah light branches this idea, which John in turn associates with the angels or the spirits and the churches. So the members, again, of the heavenly host are God's eyes. Now you might be thinking, this is kind of like our expression, like when we appoint, maybe we have a business and we appoint, somebody to be a supervisor, and the boss would say to the guy that's appointed to be the shift leader, you're my eyes and ears. That's our expression, and that's the idea. Interestingly enough, ancient Near Eastern material does include the ears. It has this kind of thing for spies, and Oppenheim points this out in his article. It's a really interesting article, but it includes the ears too. Eyes and ears, of the gods. All right. The Old Testament though only uses the eyes part. It doesn't use the ears. But again, that's just a bit of a sidebar. I thought you're probably thinking you've heard expressions like this even in our own language, and we have. We talk like this. And it's the same in Scripture. It's just it's a way of expressing that the one whom you are an extension of, this is how that person's going to know. This is gaining of knowledge. And in this case, God knows, God sees, because he has these agents, with him who are watching and recording. And again, this gets you into the whole heavenly books motif, which we spent a whole episode on. Again, we're not going to rabbit trail back into that, but again, this is what you're dealing with in this passage. Now, as I said, just a few minutes ago, the metaphor of the eyes of the Lord being connected to God's knowledge works because light penetrates or removes darkness, so that what is hidden is revealed. And the menorah branches, the lights, the eyes of the Lord go through the whole earth. But John has these light branches, which ESV translates as lampstands, which isn't great, but we'll go with it. John has the light branches as churches whose angels or spirits are in view. And again, since human beings can't see what's going on in the whole world, but spiritual beings can, this reflects this universalized language. This is another reason why it has to be universalized, because this language is true of every church, of every group of believers. Okay, because God's presence is with every believing church and every individual believer. Believers are God's temple. We are God's house. So we get all these temple house metaphors that are in the New Testament for believers as sacred space. And we are accompanied by, dare I say, the cloud of witnesses, or Hebrews chapter 1, the angels, who are sent to assist us. And now we've got the eyes of the Lord with us as churches, as believers, as groups of believers. This is New Testament theology. It's just that John is expressing it in a very metaphorical, symbolic way. But he's drawing these metaphors and these symbols from, you guessed it, the Old Testament. Okay? And it really takes us down this road of believers, again, being the reconstituted council already, but not yet. We have a role to play now. There's sort of the passive side of this, where we're being watched, we're being assisted. This whole light metaphor, that God is sending out the eyes of the Lord, his lights, his menorah branches, whatever. God is sending them out so that he can see what's going on, and that we have sort of a passive expectation there that God sees what's going on with our lives, again, especially as believers, and these agents are here to help us and assist. That all that's correct. There's actually an active side of it, though, because again, these are council members in the spiritual world, and they're doing active things. They're being light to the world, aren't they? They are, by their presence, exposing darkness. They're, the New Testament talks about believers this way too. Okay, we have a role to play now as lights to the world. We are present to and fro throughout the whole earth, are we not? The church is sprinkled, has penetrated everywhere on the planet. Okay, we are, just as these spiritual beings are, we are also his agents to go and minister and watch others. Okay, again, in a positive sense, you're the light of the world. Jesus uses this language. This should not be unfamiliar. Now, Brian Tabb is an author who has a really a nice book. This is part of the New Studies in Biblical Theology series, which is really a good series. It's put out by IVP Academic, and his volume is All Things New, subtitle Revelation as Canonical Capstone, which I really like the title. All Things New, Revelation as Canonical Capstone. And he writes this of this lampstand passage. Now just listen to this. The apocalypse's use, again, apocalypse is the book of Revelation. The apocalypse's use of lampstands as a major symbol for the churches is significant for several reasons. First, this symbol highlights the basic contrast between the church and the world, between light and darkness. Second, the lampstand imagery signals that God's people must bear the light of God's presence and truth in the world through faithful living and speaking in the Spirit's power. And then he cites Revelation 11:3 and Revelation 12:11. In Matthew 5:16, Jesus calls believers the light of the world. and summons them to, quote, let their light shine before others, unquote. As lampstands, God's people do not produce light intrinsically themselves, but hold up the illuminating, life-giving presence of God as they speak the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. Both of those phrases are right out of the book of Revelation. Revelation 1:2, 1:9, 20 verse 4, 12:11. Christian readers of the Apocalypse, tab continues, should embrace their identity as lampstands and live accordingly, eschewing worldly compromise and cowardice and anticipating the future day when the light of God's glorious presence will eradicate all of the darkness, unquote. Again, we are the reconstituted council already, but not yet. Let's ask another question. So we asked, what's up with the lampstands? Okay, that's the answer. Another question is, what do the eyes of the Lord see in Zechariah? And does John do anything with that? Okay, let's go back to Zechariah 3, 6 and 9. We've already alluded to one of the verses here. But here's Zechariah 3, 6 and 9. Now we have the angel of the Lord in the passage in Zechariah 3 again. But this is we're going to start in verse 6. We're not going to get distracted with the Satan, vision in Zechariah 3, the first part. Verse 6 we'll start. And the angel of the Lord solemnly assured Joshua. This is Joshua the high priest. And this is set in the exilic or post-exilic period, coming out of exile, at least for Judah and Benjamin, at least for a few people. The angel of the Lord solemnly assured Joshua, thus says the Lord of hosts, if you will walk in my ways and keep my charge, then you shall rule my house and have charge of my courts. And I will give you the right of access among those who are standing here. Hear now, O Joshua the high priest, you and your friends who sit before you, for they are men who are a sign. Behold, I will bring my servant, the branch. For behold, on the stone that I have set before Joshua, on a single stone with 7 eyes, I will engrave its inscription, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will remove the iniquity of this land in a single day. In that day, declares the Lord of hosts, every one of you will invite his neighbor to come under his vine and under his fig tree. I looped in verse 10. Now, isn't it interesting that this reversal is associated with the branch? It's not associated with the return of a few thousand Jews from Babylon, from 2 tribes. It's associated with the Messiah. And you all know, we've done plenty of material on the exile and how Israel's still in exile when Jesus shows up, because all the promises about returning from exile concern all the tribes and the Messiah. Again, we're not going to rehearse all that again. But here you have it again in Zechariah 3. It's associated with Jesus. But this is what he sees. He sees this stone, with a single stone with 7 eyes. I will engrave its inscription. Let's go back to the Myers commentary, Eric and Carol Myers. They write of Zechariah 3:9. Again, the stone associated with the eyes here. The attempt to identify this stone and understand its meaning in this verse has elicited an enormous scholarly discussion, which is summarized extensively by, and then they cite a writer, in the context of, his, this person they're quoting, his analysis of verses 8 and 10. The problems in dealing with the stone are related to the difficulties surrounding the placement of verses 8 through 10, and the complexities of its connection to verses 6 and 10 of chapter 4. Again, we were just in chapter 4. Zerubbabel is mentioned explicitly with respect to temple restoration, and in the process, quote unquote, stone, the word stone, appears twice. Furthermore, the stone of 3:9 is said to have 7 eyes, a phrase very similar to the one describing the 7 eyes of Yahweh that appear in the interpreting angel's explanation, immediately following the Zerubbabel passage, the insertion, she calls it, or they call it, of chapter 4, verses 6 through 10, about the 7 lamps of the menorah. To those for whom the present attachment of this oracle to the preceding Joshua vision is of paramount importance, the stone set before Joshua, is a reference to the component of the high priest garb. So let me just stop there. So some scholars, they think that stone refers to one of the gems on the high priest garb. Okay? And then they go into a little bit of an explanation about, hey, if you go back to Exodus 28, We have ornamental stones that are engraved. They have little inscriptions on them with the words "Holy to the Lord" on the turban and all this stuff. But then they go on and say this: the single inscribed stone here contrasts with the sets of inscribed stones in the high priest's ephod shoulder pieces. 2 stones, each of which signifies by means of an engraved inscription 6 tribes. It also contrasts with the one on the stones on the breastplate, 12 stones, each engraved with the name of a tribe. At the same time, it may refer to the dedicatory stelae, or stones introduced to some temple precincts and inscribed with the names of the dynasty responsible for the sacred edifice, who built it. In either case, they write, the singularity of the stone set before Joshua is being emphasized. In other words, it's one stone. And maybe it's there to symbolize the unity of the community of which Joshua is the high priest. Since, however, this stone can likewise be related to the building stone in chapter 4, when Zerubbabel is mentioned, the focus on one stone here would be analogous to the role of a single fragment of the ruined pre-exilic temple, which would have been ceremonially brought forward and laid into the renewed structure, symbolically conveying the continuity between the two. Now, let me just stop there. What they're saying is that, look, this is one stone. It's not a bunch. We're not told what's inscribed on it. And they're saying we don't think it has anything to do with the high priest and the turban and the ephod and all this stuff. They think that the stone here, with the 7 eyes associated with it in this inscription, has to do with the practice, the expectation of using a stone of the destroyed temple in the foundation of the new one, because the vision, or in this language, is given to Joshua the high priest. He is now the leader of the community. There is no king. Okay, yeah, you got Zerubbabel, he's a governor and all that kind of stuff. And by the way, Zerubbabel is soon going to disappear from the picture. But historically, both in the books, you don't have a Davidic descendant leading the people. You've got Ezra and Nehemiah, in the post-exilic age. The line of David essentially just goes into the background. It fades into oblivion. Almost. Okay, you're going to get it, obviously. There's still a messianic expectation. You're going to get it with Jesus. But in the biblical story, the leader of the community is the high priest. And that high priesthood is going to get passed on. So what they're saying is, we think that this is really about a new temple being raised up. So if you go back to, elsewhere, the Myers will, have some other things to say about this language. They would say, look, the 7 pairs of eyes, we need to deal with that. Perhaps the usage of the eyes in Zechariah 3:9 has been affected by the chapter 4 language. They're definitely connected, is what they're saying. Chapter 4, the eyes. Chapter 3 here, the whole Zerubbabel thing with Joshua, the high priest. They really think it's about the return of the people to the land and again, a new temple. A new temple. So the notion of God's eyes, they write, 7 of them, reflecting his full or complete divine vision, is a metaphoric expression for God's omniscience as well as his omnipresence. A stone, either with 7 facets or design of 7 eyes or pairs of eyes, it's grammatically dual, would signify God's involvement with and approval of the construction of his earthly dwelling. A temple building typology includes the notion that divine favor and assent must be associated with such an enterprise. Several other biblical passages likewise attest to the metaphoric usage of God's eyes to indicate divine presence, specifically in the temple. You get Psalm 11:4, Psalm 5, 6 through 8. Of course, there are many additional instances, notably in the Psalms, like Psalm 34:16, Psalm 66:7, in which the presence of Yahweh everywhere is represented by his eyes. One passage outside the Psalter in Deuteronomy 11:12 is interesting. They say God's eyes are said to be upon the land, and so assuring its fertility, a situation akin to that of the restoration of peacefulness and fruitfulness that accompanies in temple building typologies, the building or restoration of a divine dwelling. I mean, they're all over this. They think that all this language is about the new temple, and God's saying, "I am with you. My presence is going to be with you. I approve of the building of the new temple." All this kind of stuff. So let's ask the obvious here. Let's just again assume, for the sake of the discussion, let's say that the Myers are right here. They're tracking on, Zechariah 3 and 4 with the stone language and in the eyes of the Lord language and the presence of the Lord imagery that's about. And the context of Zechariah 3 and 4 that, the nation's going to be cleansed. Joshua the high priest, his garments are cleaned up. He's there. The nation's forgiven. Zerubbabel is going to lead them back, and Joshua the high priest is, their leader. He's coming back, and God is restoring, the people at least to the land, at least, again, to whatever limited degree this matters or this means. Let's just say that the Myers are tracking this correctly, and that John, is in agreement here. That like John would read Zechariah 3 and 4 and think of the same thing. This, sort of a beginning of the return from exile and having something to do with the building of the temple. So let's ask kind of the obvious question. What does this have to do in relation to 7 spirits and stars that are associated with 7 churches, but really the whole church? Because the eyes of the Lord go throughout the whole earth. What does this have to do with each other and to John? It's as if John is thinking that the churches and the divine presence and maybe even the presence of God himself, okay, because the angel of the Lord is a possibility here, as we'll learn next time in the next episode. This whole, in Revelation, it's the Son of Man, the embodied Yahweh, from Daniel 7. And in Zechariah 4, going back to Zechariah 3, going back to Zechariah 1, there is one particular angel there that might be the embodied Yahweh, the angel of the Lord. So it's as if John is thinking of all this stuff together: churches, divine presence, Jesus, the embodied Yahweh, God embodied as a man, in the Son of Man language. It's like John's thinking that all of that has something to do with temple and God's presence, in whose presence the divine council, the 7 spirits before God's throne, 7 angels, serve. Why, if John's thinking that would mean identifying the church with or as the temple, and then marrying all that stuff to the church and believers. If you're thinking, well, this sounds suspiciously like New Testament temple talk, you'd be correct. And guess where that starts in the New Testament? John chapter 2. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. That's where New Testament temple talk starts. John. And of course, it sounds like Paul, his idea that believers in the church, believers in the local churches and the corporate church are the temple of God, because, silly Paul, well, it's the body of Christ, isn't it? It's as though John's thinking that God is building his temple anew in the form of the church, which already exists, of course, when John is writing, because it is the body of Christ already, but not yet. And you know what? When John winds up his book, there won't be a temple in the New Eden either. Instead, you have the entire New Jerusalem, which also had to be rebuilt, by the way. You have the New Jerusalem. That is the place where God's presence is found in Revelation 22. I might as well read it. Revelation 22, verse 22. I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. Again, this is John. You have the Gospel of John. You have Revelation. All of these, this is New Testament theology. Again, what John's doing here is, when you essentially take all the pieces and you put them in a pile, or you try to sort out the pieces of the puzzle, and you start seeing how they might be connected, something forms out of that. Something forms. And what forms, again, is this notion of believers as the reconstituted council, because we're the eyes of the Lord too, and this eyes of the Lord language, that's the 7 spirits and stars and angels connected with the churches, and the churches are really us. That we serve in the presence of God now, and we are commissioned to do some of these same things, and the presence of God is here and with us, but keeping us together, but also commissioning us. And I mean, there's just a lot of, again, these already but not yet, this family and partner in the reconstituted council idea, all of this is sort of smashed together in these metaphors: angels, spirits, lampstands, or these menorah lights, the eyes of the Lord, and now the stone, the temple. I mean, Peter uses this language too of the builders have rejected, the one particular stone, the cornerstone, and all this. I mean, it's as though, again, John is doing New Testament theology in a very metaphorical, symbolic way. And basically, I think, that's exactly what he's doing. That's what's going on here. He's telegraphing these ideas by pulling this symbolic, metaphorical language from 3 or 4 different places. And I'll grant, he makes some assumptions when he does it. He assumes that his readers are going to be able to pick up on this, because he assumes, again, that his readers are going to have this kind of knowledge of the Old Testament. They're going to know where these things come from. They're going to see that he's transferring their meaning to Christians, to the church, to Jesus, which of course isn't happening in the original Old Testament passages, but his application of these things are theologically consistent. The New Testament theology he's building is consistent with the Old Testament theology from which he draws the data and the metaphors and the symbols. Honestly, if you don't look at it this way, John's a crazy man. Okay. Let's just look at what he's writing here. Grace to you and peace from him who is and who was and is to come, from the 7 spirits who are before his throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn from the dead, the rulers of the kings on the earth. We'll get to that, in a bit in verse 5, some other episode. But I mean, you to him who loves us and has freed us from our sins by his blood and made us a kingdom. I mean, he actually tells you in verses 5 and 6. Verses 5 and 6 are really proof of the angle that I'm building here, that it's really about the church and believers and being the reconstituted council. I'll just stop and go back. Just listen to verses 5 and 6. We've got all this spirit and lampstand and church and stone and temple talk, and I'm trying to say, look, John is just doing New Testament theology where we're the body of Christ. We are the reconstituted council, already but not yet, all this stuff. And then John just gives it to you in verses 5 and 6. From Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead and the ruler of the kings on earth. He's the king. To him who loves us and has freed us from our sins by his blood and made us a kingdom, priests to his God and Father, to him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. So amid all that spirits and angels and lampstands and churches talk and the stone, John refers to believers as a kingdom and priests. That ought to sound real familiar. It's Exodus 19. It's Exodus 19. Okay, again, let me just read the verse to you. Exodus 19, specifically in verse 6. You shall be to me, again, God through Moses speaking to the Israelites, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Kingdom of priests. When you look at it, it should be clear as to what he's doing. I mean, he takes all these pieces and, again, throws them into the blender, but this is what he's angling for. So amid all of that, we get this talk. We're, again, church, kingdom, priests, all this stuff. Now, there's a nice summary of this. Again, I'm going to go back to Tabb's book, the book All Things New, Revelation as Canonical Capstone. He writes this. The opening doxology in Revelation 1, 5, and 6 extols Jesus Christ, quote, who loves us and has freed us from our sins by his blood and made us a kingdom, priests to his God and Father, unquote. The combination of kingdom, basileon in Greek, and priests, hieres, likely alludes to Exodus 19:6, where Yahweh calls Israel a kingdom of priests. Okay? In Hebrew, it's mamlechet kohanim, or priestly kingdom. In the Septuagint, it's basileon hiratuma. Further, Tabb writes, the reference to Christ's love and redemptive work conceptually parallel Exodus 19:4 and 5, the preceding 2 verses, where Yahweh reminds Israel that he has rescued them from Egypt and brought them to himself as his, quote, treasured possession among all peoples, unquote. All the earth belongs to Yahweh as the supreme creator, but he insists that he has chosen and delivered Israel and entrusts them with his covenant. The expression kingdom of priests aptly summarizes Israel's God-given vocation as priestly mediators of Yahweh's presence, blessing, and revelation to all peoples. It's the end of the quote. So yeah, John is throwing a lot in the blender because all these ideas intertwine. He's certainly not separating the temple from the church or Israel from the church. Again, if he was, he just made a huge mess of things. And again, I'm not a replacement guy. You know, the church is a new Israel. It's not the new Israel. It's an important distinction. But John is definitely looking at one as the rightful outcome of the other. You know, this sort of thing. So again, I realize this is messy. I'm going to stop here because we want to go back into the Son of Man imagery and all that stuff. That's for the next episode. But I'm hoping this episode gives you an idea of what's in store, because John is he's literally like the kid in the candy shop. I want some of that Old Testament passage, and that one, and that one. And now let's eat them all in one sitting. He can't simply bring himself to cite one verse and then talk about it. He can't bring up one aspect of Jesus or the kingdom or his body, the church, heaven returning to earth. Again, the divine council stuff. He can't just do that. He can't just leave it go at one thing. Let's talk about one thing at a time. He ain't doing that. Okay, he can't bring up just one aspect and settle it there. And eventually it's going to turn to, final judgment and vindication and all this sort of stuff. Everything's going to get looped in here. But this is just what he does. He wants to talk about it all. And no one aspect of all this operates in isolation from the other aspects. And John doesn't care. He doesn't care if it gets messy. So this is what it's going to be like in this series. It's going to be sort of an Old Testament smorgasbord, because that is how John operates. Yeah, we are back in the book of Revelation. No surprise there, because we've just begun the series, and it's going to take us a while. We are still in Revelation 1, 7 through 20 this time. And I think what I'm going to do just to start off here is basically just read Revelation 1, because even the material we've had to this point, we've skipped around a little bit in the chapter, and we are going to skip at least one thing in the chapter today, because we can pick it up in a different chapter as we keep going, and I'll telegraph what that is in a moment. But let's just read Revelation 1 so we sort of have this in our heads again, and we're going to really kind of, park in two parts of this passage. So the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John, who bore witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ, even to all that he saw. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near. John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia. Grace to you and peace from him who is, and who was, and who is to come, and from the 7 spirits who are before his throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, and the ruler of kings on earth. To him who loves us and has freed us from our sins by his blood, and made us a kingdom, priests to his God and Father. To him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. Behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will wail on account of him. Even so, amen. I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is, and who was, and who is to come, the Almighty. I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation, and the kingdom, and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos, on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet saying, Write what you see in a book, and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, and to Smyrna, and to Pergamum, and to Thyatira, and to Sardis, and Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me. And on turning I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe, and with a golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his head were white like white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead, but he laid his right hand on me, saying, Fear not. I am the first and the last, and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore. And I have the keys of death and Hades. Write therefore the things that you have seen, those that are, and those that are to take place after this. As for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. That's the end of chapter 1. And obviously, if you've been following the series, even these first few episodes in, you could pick up on some of the things that we've talked about before. We will be sort of tapping into a little bit of that as we settle on the passages within chapter 1 that we're going to hit on today. Our focus today is going to be John's combination of the earthly servant, son of David, and the divine Son of Man. So that's going to derive, or that discussion is going to come from really 2 parts of chapter 1. There's Revelation 1:7. I'll just read that again real quickly. 7th verse. Revelation 1:7, Behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will wail on account of him. Even so, amen. So Revelation 1:7, and that's going to get sort of married to or combined in our discussion with verses 12 through 15, which again are, Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and on turning I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held the 7 stars, and from his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. Now, there are several things in that description. And prior verse 7, the reference to coming with the clouds. Here in verses 12 to 15, you've got the hair, his head was white, like wool, like snow, eyes like a flame of fire, feet like burnished bronze. Even the voice being like the roar of many waters is going to be, going to orient us to some extent in the book of Daniel. Now, most of this stuff is going to be from Daniel 7, and John's going to loop in a few other passages, but you can already tell that we're going to spend some time in Daniel today, because this is what John is angling for. But that is by no means everything. The second area of of our episode that we're going to focus on is verse 16. So I just read verses 7 and then 12 through 15, but the next verse, the verse that follows, 16. Again, I actually already read this too. In his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. That doesn't come from Daniel, either chapter 7 or somewhere else. It comes from other passages. So I want to focus today on, again, really verse 7 and then 12 through 16. But doing so, we're going to sort of, in one part, we're going to be talking a lot about Daniel 7. And another part, we're going to go off into some other passages. I'm specifically going to skip for today's episode, even though we read the whole chapter and we've labeled the episode, Revelation 1, 7 through 20. I'm going to hold off on verse 18, the keys of death and Hades, because that's easy to pick up when we hit Revelation 3, 7, and even Revelation 9, because those things are referenced there. So for the sake of time and the space of this episode, we're not going to deal with that this time, but we'll hit it. We'll hit it because there's, again, some interesting Old Testament stuff going on there. So let's jump into Revelation 1, 7, and then 12 through 15, and of course Daniel 7. It's just, the connections there are obvious. So Daniel 7, again, for those who have read Unseen Realm, this ought to be like second nature. Daniel 7 is a divine council meeting. If you've not read Unseen Realm, and you pick that book up to read it, this is going to be pages 249 and 250. I'm just going to read a little bit from those pages, but I spend a good bit of time in the book talking about Daniel 7. And I wrote this. The scene begins, that is Daniel 7, 1 through 8, with an odd vision. Daniel sees 4 beasts coming up out of the sea. The 4th beast is the most terrifying and imposing. We learn that the 4 beasts represent 4 empires, as had been the case with Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel 2. What's described next is the significant part. And this is verses 9 through 10. I'm not going to read them again. Well, you know what? I guess I should. I'll do it one more time. This is Daniel 7, 9 through 10, even though this should be really familiar. But in case we have listeners to whom this is not familiar, here we go. Here's the divine council meeting in Daniel 7, a meeting of God and his heavenly host. Daniel says, I continued watching until thrones, note the plural there, thrones were placed, and an Ancient of Days sat. Again, this is obviously God. So the Ancient of Days sat. His clothing was like white snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool, and his throne was a flame of fire, and its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued forth and flowed from his presence. Thousands upon thousands served him, and 10,000 upon 10,000 stood before him. The judge sat, and the books were opened. Now, this translation, again, this is from Unseen Realms, so I believe they use the LEB here. It has the judge. The word is actually the word for court or council. So the court sat. ESV, I think, has court, or the council. So everybody has a seat. The books were opened, and here we go. So they're meeting to actually judge the beasts, of the first 8 verses. What's going to be their destiny. So some things jump out at us right away. And I wrote here, first, we know that the Ancient of Days is the God of Israel because of the description of his throne as fiery and having wheels, which matches the description of the throne in Ezekiel 1. I mean, there's really no ambiguity here. Ezekiel's vision also included a human figure on the throne of God, like in Ezekiel 1, 26 and 27. The scholars refer to the figure in Ezekiel 1 as the divine man. You don't see all of him, but you see, again, from the waist down and so on and so forth, seated on a throne. And the throne here is the same description that you get in, Daniel 7. The only real difference is the cherubim part in Ezekiel 1. So that much is clear. We also know that from the passage that there's more than one throne in heaven, not just, it's not a single throne. There's thrones. The thrones, plural, were set up. And these thrones mark the presence of the divine council. It's like a courtroom scene. So they are going to sit and open the books. Again, we did a whole episode in the Naked Bible podcast on heavenly books. These are the basis, for judgment and so on and so forth. So this is another one of those passages. We're not going to go back into that material. But there's a meeting here to decide the fate of these beasts. And then you read verses 9 and 10, the meeting starts. Then you eventually hit verses 13 and 14, where we're introduced to a different character. This character is not God. It's not the Ancient of Days. The Ancient of Days is seated along with the council. And here we get a new character. Daniel says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him, to this human one, the Son of Man, to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples and nations and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So as Daniel 7 continues, readers are introduced a little bit more to this Son of Man character, who is distinct from the Ancient of Days. And of course, these two characters are well defined in Daniel 7. Again, for those who have read Unseen Realm, you know that the description here is a big deal because we have a deity epithet that is ubiquitous in the ancient world because it's associated with Baal, the one who comes with the clouds or on the clouds, or the cloud rider, the one who rides the chariot through the clouds, something to do with riding through the clouds. This is stock description of a deity. And it's used, some variation of this theme, these words, these phrases, are used 5 times in the Hebrew Bible. Okay. 4 of them are used to describe the God of Israel. And those references are Deuteronomy 33:26, Psalm 68, 32 and 33, Psalm 104, 1 through 4, and Isaiah 19:1. The 5th one is this passage, Daniel 7. And what's interesting about it and noteworthy about it is this time the phrase is not used of the seated God of Israel. It's used of the Son of Man. So this is part of the 2 Yahweh figures. That's part of Old Testament theology. the transcendent, Yahweh, God the Father, so to speak. I think that's a good way to put it. It'll be more familiar to Christians listening. And then we have a second person, a second Yahweh figure. And in the Old Testament, for the most part, you have a transcendent Yahweh figure. And when God interacts with people in a number of events, and some of them are really key events, he comes to a person like, whether it's Abraham or Moses or Samuel, he comes to them as a man, God as man in the Old Testament. And so, Son of Man, that carries a deity description, deity epithet with him, is not unusual in the Hebrew Bible. And it's especially noteworthy here because the two figures are clearly distinguished. And anyone familiar with the titles about riding on the clouds or coming with the clouds knows that this is language you use of Yahweh, except for here. So we've got, again, this two deity figure. And for those, again, who have not read Unseen Realm, I highly recommend that, because this two Yahwehs idea was originally part of Jewish theology up until the 2nd century AD. It was called the two powers in heaven. And Daniel 7 was a huge passage that Jewish rabbinic thinking was oriented around. I mean, they understood what I just described to you very clearly. And there's a lot of discussion about it in between the two testaments, in between the Old and the New Testament, the Second Temple period or the intertestamental period. You can get whole books written by scholars, publish their dissertations basically on the discussion within Judaism as to who the second Yahweh figure was. How do we identify this second figure? Who is that? So this is part of Judaism, part of Jewish theology until after Jesus shows up and dies, and then you have the resurrection, the ascension. Then it became something to forbid discussion over for obvious reasons, because it just smacked too much of Christology, high Christology. So orienting back here to John, John's writing 1st century, probably late 1st century. The date is indeterminate, the date of the book of Revelation, no one knows for sure, but sometime in the 1st century at the very least. And he has this imagery, and clearly, again, applied to Jesus. In the context of Revelation 1:7, again, if you read verses 5 and 6, before you even get to Revelation 1:7, this is abundantly clear. So, going back to Revelation 1, verse 5, let's just go back to a little bit of verse 4. Grace to you and peace from him who is and who was and who is to come, and from the 7 spirits who are before his throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, the ruler of the kings on the earth. He's a ruler of kings. To him who loves us and has freed us from our sins by his blood and made us a kingdom, priest to his God and Father, to him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Behold, he, Jesus, is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. And all the tribes of the earth will wail on account of him. So it's very clearly linked to Jesus here. But if you look at verses 12 through 15, you get something odd. The Ancient of Days imagery. If you go back to Daniel 7, the seated God, the God of Israel, seated on the throne, it's his hair who's white, like wool and snow. And, you get this description. But for John takes the description of the Ancient of Days and applies that to Jesus as well. Which is really odd. It's odd in one sense, because if you go read Daniel 7, it's very clear that there are two characters. But John not only identifies Jesus as the Son of Man of Daniel 7, he also takes descriptions of the Ancient of Days and applies those to Jesus as well. Again, this is part of John's theology. The Ancient of Days imagery, again, gets applied to the Son of Man in Revelation 1:14 specifically. The hairs of his head were white like white wool. And if you go back to Daniel 7, that's not the Son of Man. That's the Ancient of Days. But John says no. He feels very free to apply more deity description to Jesus. He blurs the distinction between them. Now, prior to verses 12, or this description, prior to verse 14, when you get the Ancient of Days language applied to the Son of Man, we get this cryptic language about 7 golden lampstands. That's verse 12. So we'll hit that in a moment, but It's like, what's up with that? Because that's not in Daniel 7. We don't read about lampstands there. And then you got verse 13. In the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man. Okay, now, that's from Daniel 7. I got that. But then it's clothed with a long robe with a golden sash around his chest. Well, that's not part of Daniel 7. I mean, what in the world is John doing? As I said in the last episode that we had, in this series, it's like, look, wouldn't it be nice if John just quoted the Old Testament straightforwardly, completely, so that you knew the one place he was thinking about, and then you could go back there and think about why he's using it? He just doesn't do that. It's messy. He draws stuff from all over the place and just sort of throws it all into the blender. And look at what he's doing here. So part of it, very clearly, Son of Man imagery from Daniel 7 applied to Jesus, got it. That's easy. I mean, even Jesus does that when he's on trial in front of Caiaphas. He references Daniel 7, identifies himself as the Son of Man. That's easy. But if you keep looking at what John is doing here, John's net is drawing in not only things from Daniel 7 that aren't said about the Son of Man and then applying it to the Son of Man, but John's net is wider than Daniel 7. He's drawn other stuff in. So we've got this golden lampstand stuff. We've got a man clothed with a long robe with a golden sash around his chest. And then when you get to verse 16, what in the world's this 7 stars, mouth with a sharp 2-edged sword? I mean, that's face shining like a sun. That's not in Daniel 7 either. What is he doing? Why is he doing it? So it's just messy. Now that language, let's just pick the stuff in verse 13. This description of the long robe and the golden sash. That does come from somewhere, and it comes from the book of Daniel, but it's not chapter 7. It's actually Daniel 5 and Daniel 16. Let me read those verses to you. So Daniel 10:5 is the one reference. We read this. Again, Daniel's speaking. And this is part of his vision of a quote-unquote man, all right? So in verse 5, it says, I lifted up my eyes. He's standing on the bank of the river, the Tigris River in verse 4. Then in verse 5, I lifted up my eyes and looked. And behold, a man clothed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. Okay, that's Daniel 10:5. And if we go down to verse 16, behold, one in the likeness of the children of men touched my lips. Then I opened my mouth and spake. I said to him who stood before me, my Lord, by reason of the vision, pains have come upon me. I retain no strength. So he's clearly talking to a human figure. Between Daniel 10:5 and Daniel 10:16, we have this whole Michael chief, one of the chief princes, the Prince of Persia, Prince of Greece stuff, that we're all really familiar with, those of us who are into, angel stuff. That's all in between. But sandwiching that is this figure who is speaking to Daniel, and then he gets into the Michael stuff and then comes back, and then this same figure, touches him, and Daniel's all freaked out and whatnot. So this figure isn't Michael. Okay? This figure isn't Michael. Michael's, part of the chapter, but this figure himself is not Michael. Apparently, we have a figure who is above Michael. Now, I just want to take you through this, because to sort of see the significance of the description of this particular figure, the way he's described, it will begin to make sense as to why John took this description and brought it into Revelation 1 along with the deity Son of Man stuff from Daniel 7, and he feels free to put this stuff in the same bucket. Because this is ultimately going to point to a figure who is superior to Michael. And so that fits. That merits throwing the stuff into Revelation 1. So if you think about the book of Daniel, just a little sidebar here. Daniel 8 opens with the prophet's vision of the ram and the goat. Okay? First 14 verses of Daniel 8. After conquering the ram, the goat's great horn was broken, and out of that horn sprouted 4 horns. So this is one of Daniel's weird visions. And from one of those horns came a little horn that grew high and exalted to the heavens, where it cast down some of the heavenly hosts to the ground. Then in verse 11, we read the little horn became great as the prince of the host. So this isn't a prince of princes. There's a reference here to the prince of the host, the whole host, prince of the heavenly host. Now that phrase in Daniel is identical to the phrase in the same vocabulary as Joshua 5:14, which typically gets translated the captain of the Lord's host, the captain of the host of Yahweh, prince of the host, captain of the host, commander of the army. So there's actually a connection between Daniel 8's prince of the host and the second Yahweh figure from Joshua 5. And we know from Joshua 5 that this is, again, God as man, because he tells Joshua, take your shoes off from from your feet, for where you stand is holy ground. It's the same language that happens at the burning bush, where we have God, but we also have an angel in the burning bush. So we're already being taken into the two Yahwehs thing. So the suspicion should be in your head already. Well, this figure who's not really identified, this prince of the host guy, prince of the whole host, which of course means he's above Michael, who's just one of the chief princes. Maybe that is the second Yahweh figure. Maybe that's the angel of the Lord. Okay, so just store that away. You keep reading in Daniel 8, this man comes to assist Daniel in understanding the vision. Okay. The description of this assistance, is our focus here. Its wording will prompt us to return to the phrase prince of the host. So let's just recap here a little bit, because I don't want to conflate two things. In Daniel 8, we have the vision of the horns and the little horn. Again, he's the Antichrist figure. Again, most of you will know that because of what the book of Revelation, does with this passage. And we'll get to that stuff as well. But there's this phrase in Daniel 8 that refers to the prince of the host. That's item one. You keep reading in Daniel 8, Daniel encounters a man, okay, a specific man. The description of this man who encounters Daniel to assist him will ultimately take us back to this wording, this mystery figure of the prince of the host. The man Daniel sees turns out in chapter 8 to be Gabriel. But Gabriel is commanded to speak to Daniel by the voice of another man that emanates from beyond the banks of the Ulai River, where Daniel, has been overcome by the vision and so on and so forth. The unseen man commands Gabriel, so he's superior to him. Gabriel again appears to Daniel to interpret a vision in Daniel 9. So Gabriel's part of this, but he's not this other man. This other man, in fact, instructs Gabriel. When you get to Daniel 10, the prophet again sees a vision involving a glorious man clothed in linen. This is the sash and so on and so forth. That man is not identified as Gabriel, and he's also not identified as Michael, because this unidentified man is opposed by the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece. So whoever this is distinct from Gabriel. He's not Gabriel. He's not Michael. He's being opposed by these other supernatural princes. Now, Michael assists this unidentified figure, again, specifically against the prince of Persia. And the unidentified figure later touches Daniel in Daniel chapter 10 to strengthen him. And he informs him in the first person. He says, I will return to fight against the prince of Persia, adding that he expects the prince of Greece is also going to be part of the battle. Now, we don't know who this is yet. We just know that he's not Gabriel. He's not Michael. He gives orders to Gabriel, and Michael assists him. Okay? So we've got this subordinate kind of context. We don't know who this figure is. But again, early in the chapter, in Daniel chapter 8, there was some reference to the prince of the host, the whole host. But we don't have anything directly to put them together yet, except that the prince of the host is the same line, the same vocabulary as we find in Joshua 5 for the Yahweh as a man figure, the captain of the Lord's army. Now, we don't meet this man again until Daniel 12, which, interestingly enough, in Daniel 12, there's a scene that takes place above the waters of the stream. which takes us back to the man clothed in linen in the initial appearance to the mysterious figure. With that he was on the other side of the banks of the river Ulai. Okay, so who is this guy? Who is this guy? Now, I would argue, on the basis of Joshua 5 and the similarity, really basically identical to the Prince of the Host here, I would argue that this is the angel of the Lord. Okay, this figure is the angel of the Lord. He is the Prince of the Host. He is the captain of the Lord's army. He is the angel. Michael is subordinate to him. Gabriel is subordinate to him. Michael is just one of the chief princes, so he can't be the Prince of Princes, which is a title used in Daniel 8:25, and he can't be the Prince of the Host, also again found in Daniel 8. So this superior, to me, can only really be one person, and that is the angel of the Lord. Now, if you put all this together, and again, people can get my angels book, and I have it laid out there. You put all this together, and what John does, if this is coherent, what John does in Revelation 1:7 and 12 to 15 should not be confusing. What John isn't doing, let's put it this way, John isn't describing Jesus as the Son of Man, the deity figure, and then comparing Jesus to a lesser angel. It's not what he's doing. When John picks the description about the man being clothed in linen, having the golden sash, he is referring to this figure, not specifically identified in Daniel 8 and in Daniel 10 and in Daniel 12, but who is nevertheless the Prince of the Host, the commander of the Lord's army, the Prince of all princes. Okay, this is the angel of the Lord, who is God as man in the Old Testament, who gets identified with Jesus in the New Testament. So what John is doing here should make sense. He assumes that you sort of kind of know the data points, and that you would know why he's marrying this description to the Son of Man in Daniel 7. Because they're both deity, God level, God as man in the Old Testament. They're both that. They are not just, a mere angel like Gabriel or Michael, even Michael being an archangel. Michael is one of a class. He's one of the chief princes, which means there are other chief princes. He has equals. Okay, this figure does not. There's nothing to suggest he has equals. Now, the outlier here, if you go to verse 14 in Revelation 1, let's go back to Revelation 1 here, because there's one other thing here. The hairs of his head were white, the white wool like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. Okay, that isn't all entirely in Ezekiel 1, but, it basically mostly is. The eyes like a flame of fire are a bit of an outlier. But elsewhere, you're going to see these kinds of descriptions used of God. So if you're willing to sort of find all of the little pieces of the description, you'll see that what John is doing is fusing Yahweh descriptions that come from different locations into Revelation 1 and describing Jesus this way. So it's not just Daniel 7, it's other pieces that identify Jesus with God. So you get, again, it would be nice if John was neat about it, but he's not. This is John's theology. Jesus is Yahweh embodied. He is Yahweh incarnate. And to get that point across, he's not going to restrict himself to just one passage. He's going to go different places. Let's go on another trajectory. Let's look at the lampstands again. And believe it or not, this actually contributes to what we're trying to do here. Again, trying to show that the little points of John's description come from different places, but they're consistent. They all, they work together. They all sort of produce the same conclusion. So Zechariah 4, you might recall, is the place where John gets this lampstand imagery. So let's go to Zechariah 4. Zechariah 4, verse 1. And I'll read the first few verses here. The angel of the Lord who talked with me came again and woke me like a man who is wakened out of his sleep. And he said to me, "What do you see?" I said, "I see, and behold, a lampstand all of gold, with a bowl on the top of it, and 7 lamps on it. with 7 lips on each of the lamps that are on the top of it. And there were 2 olive trees by it, one on the right of the bowl, the other on its left. And then he starts, talking to this angel. So we have this reference to the lampstand with these menorah branches. Now, here's the question. Is the angel who is talking to Zechariah? I'll read verse 1 again. The angel who talked with me came again and woke me. Well, who is this figure? To answer that, we have to go back to Zechariah chapter 1. Zechariah chapter 1. I'm going to read from verse 7. On the 24th day of the 11th month, which is the month of Shabbat, in the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, son of Iddo, saying, I saw in the night, and behold, a man riding on a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees in the glen, and behind him were red, sorrel, and white horses. Then I said, What are these, my Lord? The angel who talked with me said to me, I will show you what they are. So the man who was standing among the myrtle trees answered, These are they whom the Lord has sent to patrol the earth. And they answered the angel of the Lord who was standing among the myrtle trees and said, We have patrolled the earth, and behold, all the earth remains at rest. Then the angel of the Lord said, O Lord of hosts, how long will you have no mercy on Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, against which you have been angry these 70 years? I'm going to stop there for a moment and just draw your attention to a few things. That's Zechariah 1. There is no reference in the first 6 verses, to an angel, coming up to, Zechariah. The first, occurrence of the angel that we get is in these verses that I just read in the book. The angel who talked with me said to me. So, where did he come from? Because prior to that, we get this description, a man riding on a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees. Well, is there a man riding a red horse and a second man standing among the myrtle trees? Or are they the same? That's going to be, you say, how can they be the same? But as you're going to see, this is actually a relevant question. It's confusing. So who does Zechariah say, what are these, my Lord? Well, it's some angel who talked with me and said, I'll show you what they are. So the man who was standing among the myrtle trees, okay, now we get reference to this man. The man who was standing among the myrtle trees answered, These are they whom the Lord has sent to patrol the earth. And they answered, They, who's they? Well, it must be either the myrtle trees or somebody on the horses, or maybe the horses don't even have riders. I mean, again, there's a lot of confusing things here, but they answered the angel of the Lord who was standing among the myrtle trees. Now we get a reference to the angel of the Lord. He's apparently the man standing among the myrtle trees. Okay? So we have the angel of the Lord in this vision. But the real question is there a difference between the angel of the Lord and the angel who's talking to Zechariah? Are they different or the same? And it's actually going to matter to some extent, or at least be a possibility, when you get to chapter 4, that the angel who is talking with Zechariah is the angel of the Lord. It's not certain, but it's a possibility. You say, well, why even mention it? Again, it's a confusing passage because you have switches from the third person to the first person. You have an issue of how many men are there? Do the horses have riders? Does it matter? Can you have one angel standing among the myrtle trees, but also be the one talking to the prophet? It's a very confusing passage, and scholars have been quite frustrated about it. I'll give you an example. Eric and Carol Myers in their Anchor Bible volume comment on this passage. They say, the sequence between verse 7 and the first person account of the vision in verse 8 and following is problematic. Probably because verse 7, it could be part of the editorial framework that introduces the visions. Because if you go back to the first 8 verses, there's a switch between the first person and the third person. Again, if you're familiar with my illustration, I have this lecture about, the proof that there's editorial activity going on in the Bible. I always take people to Ezekiel 1:1-3, where Ezekiel is described both in the third person, and you also get the first person speaker, who is supposedly the prophet. So can't the prophet make up his mind to say, I did this, I saw that, I'm this person. And if it is, why does he refer to himself in the third person? It doesn't make any sense unless you have someone who has taken Ezekiel's sermons, his content, and fashioned it into a book, someone who isn't Ezekiel, in other words, an editor. You have the same thing going on here. You have these weird switches of a person, and it creates confusion. So without being able to unravel that, because honestly you can't. I mean, people try text critically to make sense of this without worrying about all that. Let's zero in on verse 8. Who is the so-called man riding on a red horse? And what is his relationship to the other characters or character? I mean, again, how many are there? In Zechariah 1:1-7. Here's what the Myers say, and it's kind of interesting. The identity of this individual on horseback is a matter of some confusion. Subsequent figures in this vision, the interpreting angel, this is Zechariah 1 of verses 9 and 13 and 14, and the angel of Yahweh, specifically mentioned in verses 11 and 12, perhaps can be identified with each other, at least in the present stage of the text, which perhaps represents a conflation of visionary materials. The man on the horseback, who is surely also an angelic being, would then be a distinct actor in this vision, yet in verse 11 he appears to be the same as the angel of the Lord. The problem is further complicated by the sudden appearance of the interpreting angel as the object of the prophet's query in verse 9. Zechariah does not introduce the angelic actors, nor does he give them proper names. We just saw that. I mean, they just pop into the scene. They pop into the text. There's no lead up to them. They don't have proper names, although the angels he depicts may emerge in later literature, such as the book of Daniel and some intertestamental writings. And then they give some possibilities. Michael, Gabriel, or some unidentified angel, which is where I'm leaning. The lack of specificity in Zechariah's use of angel figures perhaps befits their character as divine beings, which must remain beyond full ken or full knowledge. Now, again, I think that's fair. I mean, there's really no way to tell. If we ask the question, is the angel in 4:1 who again talks to Zechariah, the angel of Yahweh, and is he Yahweh embodied or is it some other angel? The answer is uncertain, but the question is interesting because for this reason. I'm going through all this for this one reason. John does allude to Zechariah 4. Let's go back to Revelation 1. John takes his readers to Zechariah 4 with this line, I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands. Now catch this. And in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man. Well, if you go back to Zechariah, the figure there associated with the lampstands, and of course also these myrtle trees earlier, could very possibly be the angel of the Lord. And what that means, and apparently John thinks it is the angel of the Lord, that means what John is doing here is identifying Jesus with the angel of the Lord. It's a very convoluted path because Zechariah is just messy. Again, because of the editorial hand, the switches between first and third person, the fact that the angels don't get introduced or identified or distinguished. But it's very possible that you could have the angel of the Lord present in Zechariah 1 and Zechariah 4, and John draws that figure into Revelation 1 and identifies him with Jesus. And if he does that, that makes very good sense, because the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament is God as man in the Old Testament, just like the Word, just like the name, just like the one who rides in the clouds. Again, if you've read Unseen Realm, all of this should be familiar to you. John is putting his theological cards on the table. He's actually being kind of redundant, to be honest with you. He could just lay down Son of Man from Daniel 7. Oh, okay, Jesus is the human one that inherits the kingdom, the human one who rides in the clouds, which is a deity description. So John, you believe Jesus was God. Yep. He could just end it there, but he actually loops in more passages. He keeps piling on. So given the clustering, again, of other factors that link Jesus to the Son of Man, to the glorified angel, in Daniel, the Prince of the Host in Daniel 8, the Prince of Princes, again, if this is the angel, and John is using descriptions of that guy and applying it to Jesus, he's piling on. He's trying to argue that Jesus is the divine man of the Old Testament. is Yahweh as a man in the Old Testament. He uses Daniel 7, he uses Daniel 10, he uses Zechariah 1, he uses Zechariah 4. Again, he could have just picked one and been done with it, but he doesn't. He just keeps piling on. And it's confusing to us because, at least in the Zechariah part, that's just confusing stuff because of the way it's written. But it's confusing to us because he doesn't actually just tell you this is why he's doing it. He just does it. And he leaves it to you, the reader, to just figure it out. Again, this is the same thing. I said it in the last episode. This is what we're dealing with here in this whole series. John is like the kid in the candy store, or, negatively, he's like the crazy man. I like all these things that I see in front of my eyes, all these bright, shiny objects. I want them all. I want to play with them all. I'm just going to grab handfuls of them and lump them all together to make my point. And if you can't figure it out, well, that's just too bad. You should be able to figure it out. So this is how it's going to be. This is what he does. This is why it's messy. And let me add this. This is why, if you're reading a commentary on Revelation that A, doesn't discuss the Old Testament, or B, only picks one item from the pile, and then builds a theological conclusion on it. Sometimes you can land in the right place there, but other times people are going to take one thing out of a passage and construct a theology, and they're going to ignore other things in the passage that really don't allow you to draw XYZ conclusion. You need to be wary of it, is what I'm trying to say. You need to, when you're studying Revelation, you need to try to trace, I don't even know if I can call them threads, try to trace John's threads, because in many cases they're just words, phrases, little pieces. I don't even know if I can call them a whole thread. This is just how he does it. It's frustrating at times, but the end result of it is, if you can see it, again, John's saying, well, I don't have just one argument from the Old Testament that Jesus is God. Here's 4 of them. Again, he piles on, which is, in the end, that's great stuff, but it's just hard to ferret it out. Let's take a little turn and go to Revelation 1:16 for what's left of our episode here. And this is, again, a single verse. I'm going to focus on a single phrase here. In his right hand, again, this figure, the one golden sash, long robe, Ancient of Days imagery, also the Son of Man, okay? In his right hand he held 7 stars, and from his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. So that's Revelation 1:16. Now, I'm not going to focus on the star element. We spent enough time on that, earlier episodes. Beale actually argues in his Revelation commentary that Revelation 1 follows Daniel 10. We just spent a few minutes talking about Daniel 10. He actually thinks Revelation 1 follows Daniel 10 in a number of elements, number of respects. He calls it, he says John has a Daniel 10 outline in places. But again, we've hit on a couple of those. We're not going to go back and pick up the star imagery and all that. I'm after the other elements. From his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. Those 2 things. So let me go back to Beale, and here's what Beale says, and this is from Beale's commentary, his commentary in the Greek text, in the International Greek Text Commentary series on the Book of Revelation. He writes, the sharp 2-edged sword proceeding from Jesus' mouth is based on the prophecies of Isaiah 11 and 49, or 11:4 and 49:2. Which adds further to his depiction as an eschatological judge and as the one beginning to fulfill this messianic expectation. That this is the primary meaning is clear from the use of the same metaphor in Revelation 2:16 and Revelation 19:15. In particular, 19:15 shows that Isaiah 11:4 is uppermost in mind here, since there we read, in order that he should strike the nations. That phrase, since that phrase from Isaiah 11:4 is added directly following the one that says, and from his mouth proceeds a sharp sword. The use of Isaiah 11:2 and 3 earlier in the chapter in Revelation 1:4 and later in Revelation 5 confirms this. So let me try to put that in a more comprehensible way. I mean, Beale is saying, look, Isaiah 11 is in John's head a lot, both in this chapter and elsewhere. So let me read Isaiah 11:4, just so that you can get a feel for it and see what Beale is latching on to. Let's see. I'll back up to verse 3. His delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see. And the he here is the stump of Jesse, the Messiah from verse 1. So the Messiah, his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see or decide disputes by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. That's Isaiah 11:4, and I might as well read Isaiah 49:2, since that's also part of this. This is the servant of the Lord, which is a messianic figure when it's an individual. The servant says, "Listen to me, O coastlands." This is Isaiah 49:1. We'll start at the beginning of the chapter. "Listen to me, O coastlands, and give attention, you peoples from afar. The Lord called me from the womb. From the body of my mother he named my name. He made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand he hid me. He made me a polished arrow, and in his quiver he hid me away." So there you have the sharp sword imagery associated with the mouth. So Beale is saying, look, this notion of striking the nations and from his mouth proceeds a sharp sword, it's very evident that John is referencing Isaiah, two passages, 11:4 and 49:2, in what he's saying. Now, Steve Moyes, again, we've cited his book on the use of the Old Testament revelation. He has similar thoughts. Let me read what he says. "The combination of the sharp two-edged sword and the sword of my mouth has suggested to many commentators that John is combining two important texts from Isaiah. The first is Isaiah 11:4b, which reads, 'He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked.' The Septuagint speaks of the word of his mouth rather than the rod of his mouth," which is interesting. And the word of his mouth is in the Septuagint. That's what the Septuagint actually has. And, again, if you're looking back at Revelation chapter 1 here in verse 16, again, from his mouth came a sharp two-edged sword. It's a sword, it's not a rod. So again, this is a good case where John is picking up on the Septuagint. So the Septuagint, back to Moyes, the Septuagint speaks of the word of his mouth rather than the rod of his mouth. And the second passage is Isaiah 49:2, which reads, "He made my mouth like a sharp sword." The two are combined in this inaugural vision, this vision of chapter 1, into, quote, "and from his mouth came a sharp two-edged sword," Revelation 1:16. They also occur in the parousia vision, which is the vision of the second coming. Parousia is an academic word that refers to the second coming. So they also occur, the same combination, Moyes says, show up later in Revelation 19:15 and 19:21. And there they are combined with some other scriptural allusions. He writes as well, the image is almost a topos in Jewish writings. I guess a rough definition of that academic term is sort of a pattern, a familiar thematic pattern. And he cites a bunch of passages, Psalms of Solomon, he cites a Dead Sea Scroll, he cites 2 Thessalonians 2, 4th Ezra, and 1 Enoch 62:2. So basically he's saying other Second Temple Jewish writers, that are contemporary or a little earlier than John in Revelation, they do the same thing to describe the Messiah. So this is not an unfamiliar description. It is certainly a description of conquest, but it's also, since it has to do with the word of his mouth, yes, there's a conquest element. Yes, it's going to get repurposed in Revelation 19 when the Lord comes back and destroys the wicked. But, there could be other things here too, as far as, speaking the truth and whatnot. The other element, the shining face, is also of interest here. And we'll talk about kind of what these things mean when we loop this one in. Matthew 17:2 is where you see this image as well, the shining face. Matthew 17:2 portrays Christ's face in the same way at the Transfiguration. Beale takes Matthew 17:2, the Transfiguration vision there, as anticipating the glory of Christ's heavenly reign. Okay, so this is sort of at the Transfiguration, the disciples that are there get a glimpse of what Jesus is going to be like, when he's reigning in his glory. And Beale writes, this anticipates Christ's heavenly reign, quote, part of which is depicted in Revelation 1:12 through 18. So he thinks, again, this has to do with, royal, ruling, reigning imagery, which would make sense because John has just talked about the Son of Man, who inherits the kingdom and rules the earth. Okay, that makes sense. Now, Moyes has some similar thoughts here. He writes this: the vision of Revelation 1:16 would not, therefore, have been read in a vacuum, but would have been interpreted in the light of present knowledge. For example, the shining face and the bright clothes might have been read in the light of the Transfiguration tradition, in which Jesus was transfigured, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. That's Matthew 17:2. So, again, what they're saying is that, look, if you have a first century reader, and Revelation, again, is one of the later books, when people read this, they're going to be thinking of Matthew's gospel, okay, or the description earlier. They're just not going to be able to dissociate, those two things. They're going to put those things together. Beale moves beyond this, though. He thinks that there's more going on than the reference to the Transfiguration. He actually connects it back to Daniel 10, which, again, he thinks Daniel 10 is a big deal in this passage. And it is, for reasons we've already stated. And again, I don't want to get into all the weeds he gets into. But he connects it back to Daniel 10, and he adds an interesting sidebar from the book of Judges, believe it or not. Beale writes this: the last description of the Son of Man as having a face like the sun shining in its strength still follows the Daniel 10 outline, but the actual wording, he says, is derived from Judges 5:31 in the Septuagint, specifically the Vaticanus manuscript. The link with which may lie in the descriptions there of the bright appearance of the victorious Israelite warrior. In Daniel 10 of the Son of Man, and here of Jesus as a warrior, it may be significant that the warrior of Judges 5:31 is associated with the stars that fought from heaven in Judges 5:20. Now, let me stop there. Let's go back to what Beale is citing here. Let's go back to Judges, and I'm going to specifically, I don't know which manuscript the Septuagint that I have here is going to be using, but let's just see what we find here. Judges 5:31. Okay. Thus may all your enemies be destroyed, O Lord. Now this is the song of Deborah. Okay, Judges 5. There's this line. Thus may all your enemies be destroyed, O Lord, and those loving him as the going out of the sun in his might. So it compares to the Lord, the divine warrior, who has given them victory. And Beale references verse 20 in the same chapter, talking about the victory, the victory that Deborah and Barak, have just experienced. They say, from heaven the stars arrayed themselves, from their tracks, or a lot of English translations have, from their courses they arrayed themselves against Sisera. This is divine warrior imagery, where the Lord of hosts, what are the hosts? You say, oh, they're angels or they're heavenly beings. Yes, they are. But Lord of hosts as a phrase also refers to the stars. So this is a reference to the heavenly warrior, God as the warrior, with his heavenly army being arrayed against Sisera and giving his people, led by Deborah and Barak, victory. And verse 31 compares the leader, the Lord, and those with him, but specifically the Lord. May all your enemies be destroyed, O Lord, and those loving him as the going out of the sun in his might. The advance of God, the warrior God, is like the sun coming out and shining, right? The sun sort of, booming, over the horizon, just coming out that way. It's light imagery. Well, Beale is saying he suspects this is where this idea of the face shining like the sun comes from, the reference to the sun. And he thinks that what, basically the end game here is Beale considers this language not just to refer to the transfiguration, Jesus' future rule and reign, but because he links it back to this Judges passage about, God being like the sun, okay? He thinks it's also divine warrior imagery. He says here, it is possible that Judges 5:31 has been applied to Christ because it is seen as typological of the ideal messianic warrior, and because John associated the Son of Man with stars in verses 16a and 20b. See, the one we're talking about, the face shining like the sun, he has stars in his hand. They are under his command. So you get the idea. Again, Beale thinks this is also divine warrior imagery. He says Judges 5:31 is a description of the victorious warrior, and this finds an escalated meaning here in Christ. Now, again, you might think, I don't know about that. The connections might be a little loose, but I think they're worth considering. Beale actually takes this passage as being about spiritual warfare, spiritual victory. Beale summarizes the theological point of the imagery this way. I'll just quote from him again. The Christians in Asia, again, these churches in Asia Minor, are to understand that Jesus will do battle in this manner, not only against the evil nations later on in Revelation 19, but also against all those among the churches who compromise their faith. Basically, any enemy of the gospel, the warrior, the risen Christ, the Son of Man, the one whose face shines like the sun, the transfigured warrior, the transfigured, victor, all these things combined, basically, Beale is saying, this is the warrior element of the Son of Man should not be forgotten. It's one thing to think about the Son of Man coming and offering spiritual salvation. But he's suggesting, and I think he's onto something here, that when believers read this, again, they're expecting the Lord to return and to deliver them from evil and to deliver them from their oppression, and they're under persecution and all this. He thinks, look, we have to realize that this imagery is not just sort of a kind of a soft form of encouragement that, when life catches up to and you're going to die, you're going to be with the Lord because you're on the Lord's side, and all that's true. But he's saying, look, this is warfare imagery. And when the Lord returns, he's not coming back, as I like to say, blowing kisses. He's coming back and he's going to clean house. And so John is using warfare imagery, drawing it from the Old Testament, to remind people that the Lord's coming will not just be for the salvation of the faithful, it will be for the judgment of the wicked, and everything, everywhere, everyone everywhere who opposes him will, to put it succinctly, get what's coming to them, whether it's spiritual forces or human forces, and no matter where those human agents are. They could be within the church, they could be outside the church. But if you are not on the Lord's side, the side of the Lord of hosts, the captain of the Lord's army, again, think about all this imagery that weaves together. The commander of the host, the one, dressed in the white robe and the golden sash, who happens to be the one commanding Gabriel and Michael, and the Son of Man from, Daniel, again, who's going to rule the nations. Out of his mouth, we either have a rod or the sword. All of this is warfare imagery. So John is not just writing words of encouragement to sort of cheer people up that, when push comes to shove and the end comes, you're going to be with the Lord. That's all true. But he's reminding people that the return of the Lord for the wicked, for those who oppose him, is going to be a terrible thing. It's going to be a terrible thing. And all this fits well, again, with the whole Son of Man idea. And the use of the Old Testament here, again, is putting forth Jesus as the true king, not just in terms of rulership and favor toward those who are on his side, but he's against something too. This is why, look at verses 17 and 18 that follow this description. Fear not. I am the first and the last and the living one. I died, behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. and you could add a footnote there, and I know who I'm putting in there. I mean, it's just I'm coming back to fill the realm of the dead and Hades as well. Again, this is warfare imagery. So, we need to keep these things in mind. Again, John is not always going to, portray Jesus as something comfortable. He certainly doesn't do it here. We who are on the Lord's side, we look at the positive side of all this. But John is saying, there's another side to this coin, and it's not going to be pleasant. It's not going to be pleasant. And so part of his description in chapter 1 isn't just to say, hey, Jesus is God. Don't forget that. He's also saying, hey, one of God's roles was to be a warrior, to destroy the evil and wickedness. So if Jesus is that, well, he's that too. And he wants to present, just a full picture of the whole thing. It is time. This is all set up to Revelation 2 and 3 when he addresses the churches. It's all set up for the churches. And, the Lord's going to have some uncomfortable things to say to the churches. It's time, to quote Peter here, it's like he's saying it's time for judgment to begin at the house of God first. So you're going to get some encouragement, but you're also going to get some reckoning. And, John wants people to what? To keep believing, stay on the Lord's side. Don't switch sides. I mean, don't do that. Don't do that, because this is what's coming.